For those who don't know me, I am Naizam Kanji, the Director of the Office of Mergers and Acquisitions at the Ontario Securities Commission and Special Advisor to the Chair on Regulatory Burden Reduction. I'd like to extend a warm welcome and thank everyone for attending the OSC Roundtable on Reducing Regulatory Burden, and also to those who have joined us by webcast. This roundtable is part of the OSC's ongoing consultation on reducing regulatory burden in Ontario's capital markets and in improving the investor experience. I would like to acknowledge the extensive and excellent comments we received in response to our staff notice on burden reduction. We are reviewing and considering all of the comments as we move forward in our burden reduction initiative. I would also like to thank the speakers on each of our panels today. I'm looking forward to an interesting and informative discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to take care of some housekeeping items. Coffee is available at the back of the room. Hopefully you won't need too much of it. Restrooms are located downstairs in the main lobby. We are live streaming today's event and will be recording the webcast and transcribing the roundtable. You can also participate in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag OSCRegBurden, which might be on our screen. We will make both the recording and transcript available on the OSC website. We are also taking photos that may be posted on our website. The format of today's event consists of 3 panels that will explore regulatory burden reduction opportunities and challenges. We will provide time after each of the 3 panel discussions for questions from the audience in the room and on the webcast. For the audience in the room, if you have a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. For a webcast audience, if you would like to pose a question, click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom right corner of your screen. There are a lot of people participating today, and we want to get the most out of the discussion. Please bear with us as we have a full agenda. We will get to as many of your questions as we can. And now, I'd like to introduce OSC Chair and Chief Executive Officer Maureen Jensen, who will provide the opening remarks. Maureen. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first of 3 roundtables on reducing regulatory burden. I'm very happy to see you all here. As you know, we often host roundtables considering policy initiatives in order to hear from our stakeholders and to get your input. We value your contributions and we appreciate you taking part in this process. But today's roundtable is different than others that we've hosted. We're discussing the removal of obligations and not the addition of rules. This is critically important to you, as I can see the number of people not only in the audience but participating by webcast. So we welcome all of you today, and we hope we can get to each and every question, but even if we don't, we'll make sure we transcribe them all and then we will answer them later. So I wanted to just start by saying that addressing regulatory burden has been a focus of mine since I became chair in 2016. I've been on the other side. It's a long time ago. It feels like a very long time ago now. But I was the CEO of a junior mining company. So I know firsthand what it's like to deal with small budgets and big obligations. And I know about the costs and the frustrations that result when requirements are unclear or inconsistent. So I get the challenges. And I can say with confidence that the OSC is moving to tackle the issues behind them. There is no question that reducing regulatory burden is critical to Ontario's business competitiveness and economic strength. You know that this is a major focus for both our minister and the government. In fact, Minister Fedeli will be speaking to you later this afternoon, and he's doing that to send a clear signal on how important this initiative is. So as you recall, last November, we announced the formation of this Burden Reduction Task Force. In 4 months, we've established the task force, we've sought your comments, you responded, we've summarized the comments, and here we are today. So as you can see, there's many of our staff in the audience, and we're all ears. Nothing is off the table. But that said, this in no way changes the mandate of the OSC. We are reducing burden. We are not reducing our focus on investors. In fact, the goals of reducing burden and protecting investors do go hand in hand. We know that when our requirements are clear and our processes are simple, all investors and market participants get better disclosure. That helps everyone make better decisions. And we get better data, which also helps us tailor our oversight, and we get better information. So I think we can all agree that duplication, redundancy, and outdated processes don't benefit anyone. So we've heard this loudly from you in 65 comment letters. We also conducted an online burden reduction survey, and we have continued through this entire process to meet with industry and investor advocates as part of this consultation. In May, we will be hosting 2 additional roundtables on specific issues. The next one will take place on May 6th and focus on registration, compliance, and investment funds. And then the third one will be on May 27th, and it will deal with trading, marketplaces, issuer requirements, and derivatives rules. So in addition to seeking your input, internally at the OSC, we have done an exercise much like you did. We've looked at our requirements, our systems, and our processes, and we've asked all of our staff to focus on what is necessary and relevant and what can fall away or be simplified. So we're also reviewing our existing policy initiatives, which you know there are several out in the marketplace right now, to ensure that we're not imposing greater burden than necessary. So we're setting goals for reducing burden over the short term, which for us is within the next 6 months, the medium term, which is the following year, and the longer term, which is the next 24 months and on. In cases where we're considering changes to harmonized national rules, we will work with the CSA to do that. Burden reduction is also in the CSA's priorities, and together we have a number of harmonized initiatives already in progress. And you've seen that we have several in the corporate finance area, as well as we have several in the investment funds area. So we are keeping the CSA updated on our review and consultation process, so they're aware of what we are hearing. Today we have representatives of the AMF attending our roundtable, and we have several other members of the CSA participating by webcast. So I can tell you there is an energy around the OSC around this initiative. We are in regular contact with the Ministry of Finance to share feedback, and we are all excited about the opportunity to make regulation work better for everyone. But it is a cultural change, and it's something that we will do over the short, medium, and long term. We truly appreciate the thoughtful and well-crafted comments that we received. It is clear that there is a strong conviction out there on what needs to change, which is fantastic in my book. So last weekend I read the summary of all of the letters. I've read most of the letters, but I've read the summary of all of them. 75 pages of suggestions, which I think demonstrates the depth of work that people put into their comment letters. Of course, based on this input, there are going to be tough choices to make. And with the support of our ministry, we will prioritize the projects to make the most impactful changes. So today's roundtable is a critical part of this process, and we want to hear from you. So please speak up and join the conversation. Again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to a very productive discussion today. Thank you. So now I'd like to turn things over to Mary Condon, the Interim Dean of Osgoode Hall Law School and former OSC Vice Chair and Commissioner. So Mary will be moderating our first panel, and they will discuss regulatory burden and its impact. And she's going to kill me, but it's her birthday today.
Thank you very much, Maureen, as long as I don't have to reveal how old I am. We're all good. Thank you very much to the OSC for inviting me to join the session this afternoon. I completed my term there a couple of years ago, so it's very nice to be back. And I'd also say that in my current role as a member of the board of the Capital Markets Association Implementation Organization, it's always of interest to that organization to hear more about regulatory efficiencies that can be achieved. So let me introduce the members of our first panel, and they are all, of course, very well known to you. To my immediate left is Paul Burke, who's the President and CEO of the Investment Funds Institute of Canada. Next to him is Randy Cass, the CEO of Nest Wealth Asset Management Incorporated. After Randy is Frank Laferriere, the chair of PMAC, and then last but absolutely not least, Ian Russell, the president and CEO of the Investment Industry Association of Canada. So the format for our discussion this afternoon will be that I have a number of questions that I'm going to be putting to the panel, and for most of the questions, we've identified a lead commentator who gets the most airtime, followed by the other commentators adding their remarks as well. However, for the first question, I'm going to give everybody equal time, so you can imagine that this is probably the most important question of all. And before we get started, I just also want to note that there will be an opportunity at the end of this panel for audience members to ask questions of the panelists, and I certainly encourage you all to take that opportunity to hear from our expert commentators. So let me turn to the first question, and as Maureen mentioned, we're all here, I think, this afternoon because we understand that there's a possible impact for financial institutions and all market participants across the industry to be affected by regulatory burden. So I'm going to ask each of the panel members, starting with Ian, to say how it is that, for purposes of his organization and his stakeholders, he thinks that the regulatory burden has impacted his day-to-day activities.
Thank you, Mary, and may I start by commending the OSC for hosting this panel, this session this afternoon. I think it's very important for our capital markets and our economy, and happy birthday to you, Mary. I'm going to lead off and give you some sense of the impact on my industry, and obviously the place to start with that is the costs that have been borne by the industry from largely regulatory compliance, but not exclusively. The operating costs in the industry last year rose 7%. They rose 9% for the self-clearing firms, and they rose 18% for the introducer firms. That's against an inflation rate ranging between 1% and 2%. Over the last year, operating costs in the industry are 15% higher than they were 3 years ago. Now, obviously, there are other factors that lie behind the cost increase, technology being one that's not necessarily related to regulatory compliance, but as I'll say, indirectly it is. But a good part of that cost increase comes from the compliance burden that the industry has shouldered, and it's something that we've been through really for the last 6 years in total. And I want to just touch on quickly four areas where it's hit. Is the burden has fallen very heavily on the advice component of the industry. As a consequence of that, and the fact that fees for advice have generally gone down, it's meant that advice has become a precious commodity. It's more targeted. It's a bit more rationed than it would be. And what that has meant is, for many of the firms in the industry, they are looking at it by segmenting clients in terms of their portfolio size. And they are also raising the thresholds. These are the full-service dealers on clients that they will deal with because of the cost and relative to the revenues in the business. And I think the biggest challenge here is with the affluent mass market, of which my industry is probably leaning more to the higher end of it. But smaller clients have as much need for advice and as much need for good products and services and a balanced product shelf as high net worth clients would have. but obviously their portfolio sizes are far smaller. And so the challenge for everybody ranging from my industry down through the mutual fund industry and the online wealth providers is to be able to provide that mix of product and advice on more difficult economics than were there before. So that would be the challenge. The second impact of this, or consequence of the burden, has been the fact that because of the compliance burden, it's meant that technology has tended to be put off, delayed, or in some cases not brought forward. This is technology to improve the client experience, and there's lots of cases where firms have an aggregate annual budget for their wealth business, and they've got to allocate that between compliance and between technology and improving the client experience. And to the extent that the compliance burden goes up, the residual falls. So that's been another casualty of the burden. The third one is just the inefficiencies that are thrown up in the firm and the advisor, but particularly the firm, in dealing with the regulator. Obviously, when you have as large a rule book as we have, and as intensively scrutinized businesses we have, there's a lot of interchange with the regulators, and there's a lot of focus on complying with a wide range of rules. And if you look at our submission, you'll see that the complexities unnecessarily are there. These are complexities relating to the duplication of rules between IROC and between the OSC, and between, so it's duplication and just of the rule book, and that's created I think a significant burden on the firms. And there's lots of examples that are in there for the same activities. The rules are slightly different. Now that would extend to things like registration as well, where in some provinces the authority is delegated to the SRO, in other jurisdictions it's delegated to the commissions. The other area I want to talk about is the inefficiencies quickly, the inefficiencies that are thrown up by our clients. And just to pick on one, and again it was high in our submission, is we need to really move forward as expeditiously as we can to embrace technology. It's really the electronic delivery of documentation. And I think there's a need for rule changes there, as well as, and this is also taken in the context of a rapidly changing technology. But again, I think that it's more of an inertia here with I think it's 11201 National Instrument, but also in terms of prospectuses and the electronic delivery of prospectuses. I know this is more at the national level, but again, raising that because I think Ontario, the OSC, can take leadership in moving that forward. So those turn out to be pretty serious encumbrances for the business on that front.
So Ian, thank you very much for those comments. Before I turn to Frank as our next speaker, could I just ask you a follow-up question? You mentioned with respect to the second of the areas that you discussed that because of the compliance burden, technological efficiencies have been put off. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by the compliance burden? I mean, are there particular features of that you would point to that your members find to be the most onerous?
Well, I think it depends on the firm, Mary. I mean, I think that what I'm saying is the compliance burden itself is fairly generic, and that's certainly added to costs and eaten away at the available budget. And all I'm saying is that technology is advancing dramatically. This is the interface between the clients and the firms. I mean, it's everything from online KYCs, which is the more recent push. Some firms moving ahead more quickly than others. Again, it's aimed at bringing convenience and efficiencies, in that case, to client opening process. But what we see is Broadridge and Fidelity and other providers that have a lot of applications that improve the experience and the servicing to the client. And again, all firms are differently, but I'm just saying generally that if you've got limited financial capability, because first and foremost the priority goes to regulatory compliance, you'll either put off that technology, client-facing technology, or cancel it altogether. And there are examples that I've seen around the industry of that.
Great. Thank you very much, Ian. Frank, I'll look to you next.
So happy birthday. And just for the record, I'm the chairman of the Private Capital Markets Association, which is the PCMA, not the PMCA, not PMAC. So, and again, thank you to the OSC and the Minister for looking at this very important issue, because our industry is crucial to the prosperity and well-being of not only the province, but also the country. And, you know, just to give an idea of what we're talking about, that's what we're talking about. My association represents a wider range of issuers, dealerships, stakeholders that must comply on a daily basis with this. And this is just Ontario. This doesn't cover off the rest of the other security commissions or the SROs. And the sheer volume and the rate of change has been immense in terms of the impact. And ultimately, it's the customer that pays for this, which is unfortunate, because capital formation is crucial to the innovation and productivity of our country. The primary purpose, what is the highest value add that we as an industry, as a regulator, or a government should be doing? Our highest value add is to create wealth for our customers, for our clients. I don't see anything in here. To be quite honest, I haven't actually read every single page. I don't see anything in here that actually addresses the wealth creation component of it. And so we have small members, dealerships that are like 1 or 2 people. We have issuers that have great ideas that are struggling to raise capital because they must actually engage. I love my lawyers, I love them all, but the charge-out rates can be anywhere from $500 to $1,000 an hour. To be able to put something together that can meet the regulatory requirements to form capital and foster innovation and creativity, in my mind, actually poses a risk to us. And so we warmly welcome anything that will help streamline this. Nobody is saying we don't want regulation. I think it was one of the senators in the States said that a market without regulation is called theft. We don't want that. What we want is smart regulation, and we think that it's an achievable goal that will provide the balance of the protection that's so essential for our retail clients, but also allow capital to formulate. And so we look forward to and embrace this whole process.
So Frank, if I had to push you a little bit on what aspects of the legalities around wealth creation that you feel are an obstacle to your members, could you say specifically?
I'm glad you asked that. So we have built into this whole process, so the 45106F form. In my industry, you know, oftentimes we'll do a capital raise, but the NAV won't come for 2 or 3 days. Maybe take a month to calculate it, right? And so that means we'll file preliminary, which oftentimes our members will have to get the lawyers involved, and then we have to file an amended one, and we have to file again. That duplication is a small thing, but then take that and replicate that across the whole process. I mean, there are instances which we've made in our submission, which we think we're happy to work with people to try to correct that. But at the core is, what is this wealth creation? You know, how are people creating wealth? And we look at examples and role models like CPP, yet to get an exempt product in the hands of a non-accredited investor is a challenge. It's a challenge. You know, the bias that says every OM is high risk may or may not be applied. I think we need to make it so that there can be an exercise of professional judgment. And don't get me wrong, we have to protect the public, absolutely. But really and for truly, you know, I'm very proud of our association. We've done a great job in trying to raise the proficiencies. You know, we offer compliance training, we offer a number of things to our members, and I would suggest that on the exempt side, which exempt doesn't mean non-regulated, it's still regulated, that proficiency and that safety level should be coming up. So I'd like to see that encouraged.
Great, thank you very much. Randy.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you to the OSC for putting on this roundtable. I would clearly be rude if I didn't wish you a happy birthday, so
Please stop.
happy birthday. No. But now you're going to be really rude because you either don't do what Mary asked or you wish her a happy birthday. I would also like to just say that by way of introduction, my name is Randy Cass. I'm the CEO of Nest Wealth. We are the largest independent digital robo-advisor in the country, but also about 75 to 80% of our business is providing the actual engine that powers the digital offerings of a lot of the banks and insurance companies and other regulated entities that are trying to figure out what to do in this new environment. I think I've been invited to speak on this panel to come at this issue from the point of view of a company that's trying to innovate, and what the regulatory burden has done to us from the very first days until today. We're 4 or 5 years old. We're about 50 people right now. We've had rapid growth, but in some cases it's been perhaps in spite of some of the burdens that we've been put under, and in other cases it's been because the OSC and other regulated bodies, regulatory bodies made the exact right call. 3 quick examples that I'll touch base on that we experienced and that kind of speak to some first principles. Right out of the gates, the very first person we hired back in 2013-14 was an actual compliance person. They were the very first person that a startup hired, perhaps for the first time in history. And it was because we are experienced in this industry, we knew what we were getting ourselves into, and we were a registrant already at the time. The number one thing that happened then, though, was that when we went out to raise money, some of you might not be aware that there's actually a regulatory requirement that if you're going to take an investor in greater than 10%, you need to have compliance look over it from the OSC and sign off on it. That is a huge bug in the ointment if you want innovation to come from within the industry as opposed to people who have no experience with regulated entities to do startups. There are 2 types of companies in this industry that are trying to build new solutions. Those that have deep experience in industry knowledge and are trying to bring technology to that, and those that have deep technology experience and are trying to bring that to the industry. We are well served by both, but you need to level the playing field. And in that process of trying to raise capital, what was a 30-day process, as stated in the guidelines, to have the OSC sign off and say they are a good investor, turned into a greater than 90-day process, scared some investors from wanting to invest capital in us, and perhaps delayed the start of other innovative companies. So when you have overarching rules that existed, obviously, for a purpose at a time, but now you're trying to encourage innovation from within the industry, there might need to be the necessity to carve out certain scenarios and make sure that those that need capital to bring good solutions to the marketplace can actually do it. Once we're up and running, we very quickly ran into the process of trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, and that was the notion that everybody who signed on a digital robo-advisor had to have a phone conversation with a registrant before you could do anything within the portfolio. In theory, this makes perfect sense for everybody that was involved decades ago. When you have a mandate of trying to bring good, low-cost solutions to protect the investors from things like high fees, you have to understand that in many cases, those solutions are going to necessitate a different framework than what's existed for decades previously. And at the same time as we're incurring costs by being subject to regulatory requirements and having to hire registrants to have phone conversations, by the very nature of that hiccup in the process, you're also inhibiting the ability of solutions to scale in a meaningful way, which means that you only have one of 2 things. You can apply for an exemption, again, costly, time, uncertainty, or you cannot scale to the extent you want. So that was the second thing. A separate framework. We've always kind of prided ourselves in Ontario in the notion that the robo-advisors and digital advice has always played under the same guidelines and on the same playing field as everybody who was in existence at the time. And I think that served us really well when you look at some of the mistakes other jurisdictions have done. But there were clearly things, and the phone call quickly became a digital conversation, and now you can file for an F5 to get exempted from that. But there are clearly things that at the start probably could have made that round peg fit into a round hole. Final point, because I think it's critically important, I don't hear it talked about as much. We are talking about the removal of regulatory burdens today, and I'm going to say that is not nearly enough to achieve what we want to achieve. Here's the example that I always use. We are digital start to finish. All our clients are. And when a transfer form goes out, it has a digital signature on it. And I can still tell you we get an obnoxious amount of firms replying back that we don't accept digital signatures for transfers, even though they have been legal in this country for everything but the very rarest of exemptions for the past decade. There is a difference between removing a regulatory burden, for example, you can only take a wet signature, and enforcing that you have to take an innovative solution like a digital signature. So as we're sitting here thinking about these things, the removal is only part of the battle. If every major firm in this country decided tomorrow that they were only going to take wet signatures and not digital signatures, innovation in fintech in Canada would grind to a halt. And we need to be aware of that as we think about these things.
Great. Thank you very much, Randy. And some of those comments, I think, will feed nicely into things that we want to go on to talk about a little bit later. But before we do that, it's time to hear from Paul about the regulatory burden impact on his organization.
Thanks, Mary. And I'm sure, thank you to Maureen and the OSC for hosting this. And I'm sure they will hear and have heard many things they've heard before. They're going to be told to do things they're already doing or that they plan to do. So it's sort of in the spirit of that I'd like to make my comments. So regulatory burden reduction isn't deregulation, and it isn't abandoning investor protection. You can't have investor protection and competitive markets without market integrity, and that requires rules. So I'd like to provide, in my opening remarks, a bit of a working definition. What is the regulatory burden? And I think it's made up of 4 components. The rules, how the rules are made, how the rules are administered, and how the rulemaking process is overseen by government. So those are the 4 elements that impact on investment fund managers and distributors. And let me start by saying that the rules in a regulatory burden reduction exercise, we don't need to boil the rule book. Most of the rules, in my view, have a sensible purpose. Most of them have a rationale. And so a lot of the outcomes that are intended by the rules would have to be achieved by the market participants in any event. That is, without the Securities Act. Things like financial compliance, things like risk management, compliance with laws of general application, compliance with the common law, compliance with employee and customer expectations. All of these things cost money, and they all are part of compliance. So we're not talking about the entire regulatory framework. Our submission identified 6 rules that we think should be either rescinded or amended or exemptions granted from them. And that's because, in our view, those rules are unnecessary because they duplicate other processes, or they're ineffective. They don't achieve what they were supposed to achieve. And that's, I think, what we should focus on when we're talking about the rules. What about the rulemaking process? I think that's even more important than the rules. And so it's important that we look at how the rules are made. And in our submission, we describe a number of techniques and methodologies that could be implemented to ensure that the rulemaking process has rigor and starts with a complete and detailed description of the regulatory problem that the regulators are trying to address. So the rulemaking process has the potential for significant streamlining of the regulatory framework and reducing the regulatory burden in the future. The most important aspect of the regulatory burden, in my view, is the administration of the rules we have. How are the rules administered? And in our submission, we make a number of recommendations for better coordination, harmonization, and reliance, both between branches of the OSC, between the CSA members, and between the CSA members and the SROs. I think there is a lot of potential to streamline the regulatory burden through cooperation, harmonization, coordination of how the rules are actually applied. And all of these issues, I think, are within the mandate of the OSC. And the last element, which isn't in the mandate of the OSC, is how government oversees the rulemaking process, and there are some valuable lessons that can be imported from other provinces in terms of the provincial government's government-wide program to reduce the regulatory burden. There's an old saying, many of you have probably heard it, that bureaucrats cut red tape lengthwise. Well, there really does need to be a government-wide approach to reducing the regulatory burden, and there are examples of programs in other provinces, things like counting the number of requirements that the agency puts forward and requiring the agency to rescind one for each new one they bring forward. So there's different techniques that can be used, but so how the rules are made and how they're overseen by government is an important part of the regulatory burden.
Thank you very much, Paul. So then you're up next to be the first commentator on our second question, and it has to do with the issues that were identified in the OSC's consultation notice about the sources of regulatory burden. But since you've already referenced the fact that you think that one of the problems is the lack of harmonization across regulators, which was something that the OSC referred to in its notice, can you give us an example of, your top example of how the lack of harmonized approach across the government and self-regulatory organizations has an impact on your members?
Sure. I mean, there are a number of examples in our submission with respect to that. There is one example is the differential understanding, interpretation of a national instrument as between different branches of the OSC, which result in different outcomes and unnecessary activity between the regulated entity and the.
And so, do I infer that since you would mostly deal with the investment funds branch, that it's a differential interpretation between investment funds and other branches?
Corporate finance and investment funds would be the example I'm thinking of. Right. So there are lots of examples, and we've highlighted a number of them in our submission on how the regulators and the SROs can collaborate more effectively. But in terms of other areas to look at, I just wanted to kind of focus on one area, and I touched on it a little bit in my opening remarks, so I would like to elaborate a little bit, and that is improving the rulemaking process. There's an awful lot of potential here to reduce and streamline the regulatory burden. And in the submission we provided, we referred to a number of rulemaking methodologies, the FCA cost-benefit analysis methodology. We refer to the regulatory impact analysis approach, the OECD reference checklist for regulatory decision-making. So we refer to a number of different exemplars of good rulemaking practice. And to me, and while they're all a little different, they all start at the same place, a good problem definition. Once defined, the problem becomes actionable. But it takes a lot of work. It's not easy. And so once you've defined the problem, you know what it is, you know the contours of the problem, then you have to ask yourself, does it warrant regulatory intervention? Do we have to intervene? Will the marketplace resolve this? Will some other agency look after it? Is it within the remit of some other regulatory agency? So you've got the problem. Does it warrant regulatory intervention? If it does, what does success look like? What would problem resolution look like? So after you've done all that, then you consider the solution. And the solution could be a variety of things, and it shouldn't start with an assumption that a new rule is the best way to go. So without a good beginning of problem definition, in my view, the whole rulemaking process can go off the rails. It ensures that the resources of the organization are targeted on high priority items that are within its mandate. And let me also suggest that this is an opportunity, a formal opportunity, for the regulator to consult with stakeholders, including the industry, on the problem definition process and on what the regulator thinks the problem is. In my view, that should be a formal process. It'll take some time, absolutely, but that time will be recouped, in my view, in the long term in the consultation process, which once we all agree on the problem, the consultation process should be streamlined. So I put my hand up for a more effective rulemaking process.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. Randy, I'll come to you next. In terms of the kinds of things that the OSC has already identified as potential issues for removing regulatory burden, do you agree that they've targeted the right things in the notice, or are there other areas that you think they should be adding to the list of things to consider?
I like the way that Maureen spoke about it when she was up here. Short term, next 6 months, give me something between 6 months and 18 months, and then the longer term. I think the symbolic value of taking half of this and ripping it off and saying, here's your new regulatory rule book, and the rest is still there, but it's a principle-based approach. Or we've decided after decades that maybe we don't need to understand your OBAs on volunteer work at your children's school. I mean, oh, sorry, did that touch base? Sorry. I mean, I think you start with the low-hanging fruit. You get some really easy wins. You get some momentum behind you. So are they the biggest issues? No, absolutely not. But no one is a huger supporter of getting wins up on the board in the early days than I am. So I am fully in favor of the way that they're tackling this.
Thanks, Randy. Frank.
So, there's a lot, I think you're going to find a lot of alignment with a lot of the people here, but I would have to sort of agree with Paul for the most part in terms of why is there a rule in the first place? I mean, I sit on a lot of committees, and the number one question I keep asking is, what are we trying to solve for? And I never get a clear answer. It seems like a good idea, but in the absence of a process that has a robust cost-benefit analysis, ultimately the rule becomes self-serving, right? One of the other things I'd like to suggest is that the perhaps the Commission adopt kind of like a client service perspective. My members would like the ability to call in to the Commission and say, we're thinking about this, what do you think? Oftentimes the response is, well, go talk to XYZ firm, law firm, because they're fully familiar with our views. Fundamentally, I find that offensive because I view my relationship with my regulators as a partnership. I shouldn't have to pay $10,000 to get an opinion on a direction or a thought before we may or may not even begin to go down that path. So I would like some sort of customer service, approach so that registrants and firms can develop a more closer dialogue. The SROs tend to have this. I think it's a great model. The other thing, too, I would like us to concentrate on is to an earlier point in terms of consistency of discussion. The interpretation of a national instrument in one part may or may not be applied. And so oftentimes business people make decisions based on conversations. So, to me, those are the low-hanging fruit because as a business person allocating capital, our members need to have a certain degree of certainty, and anything we can do to firm that up would go a long way in my mind in terms of reducing and streamlining the whole rule books.
Thanks, Frank. Ian.
Thanks, Mary. A couple of points come to mind. One that I think Randy picked it up when he was talking about wet signatures and digital signatures. And when you get new players in the marketplace, you have to adjust the regulatory framework to accommodate the expansion and the growth of that. And I think one thing we've been calling on for a long time, it's not explicit in our submission, is proportionate regulation, which is to say that we should be much more sensitive to smaller firms, both in terms of the nature of their business and how we apply know your client and suitability rules and how we audit them. And I think there is room there to relieve the burden without impacting the overarching need for investor protection. Another point, and Paul, you asked Paul the question about, where do you see examples of the need perhaps for more harmonization? And I know in Paul's submission and mine, we had a lot of examples of the lack of harmonization and differences in definition across a lot of different areas of the business. But one thing where I see perhaps a dissonance at the CSA level is not simply in terms of the rules, but it seems to me that there could be a better job done in identifying priorities. For example, two examples have come to mind. One is the National Systems Rebuild Plan. You know, this was started in June of 2016. Here we are 3 years later. We haven't heard anything. I don't know where it stands, but in that intervening 3 years, we've had to deal with a pretty clunky, inefficient system. And I know there's a lot of good intentions everywhere, but we don't seem to have placed much of a priority on getting some progress on that. Another example would be the CSA putting out a submission request for comments on streamlining prospectuses. That's everything from removing the review from preliminary prospectuses to perhaps eliminating them, again, the electronic delivery of prospectuses. Huge gains in efficiency coming from that. Well, that submission was made by our industry and all of you in July 2017. And now these same arguments are being raised in the context of the OSC debt burden reduction, which is a good thing. But I think sometimes the problem is not so much getting the idea, but really putting a priority and getting rid of the inertia to move forward. And hopefully this is one vehicle that can accomplish that.
Great. Thank you very much for those thoughts, Ian. I want to move to a topic that I think has already come up in a couple of the panelists' remarks, which is this idea that maybe what we need to focus on is not the notion of just less regulation, but actually the notion of smarter regulation. Is there a way that we can refine or redirect regulatory activity so that it is actually achieving the objectives that are intended? And Frank, you had, I think, mentioned this issue earlier in your remarks, but is there anything else that you want to add now?
Yeah, I think to me this is actually the key focus, right? Investor protection is primal for all of us because at the end of the day, Canada is a small country. We're smaller than the state of California, and so it's important to all of the financial institutions and to all the intermediaries and all the issuers to serve their clients well. That said, we still need investor protection, and at the end of the day, hearkening back to what Paul had suggested, smarter rules that focus in on what are we trying to solve, and is there an innovative way and creative way to address it. Anytime our members try to think outside the box, it usually involves seeking an exemption, right? Which is like going to the divorce court. You're going to have to spend a lot of money and then have almost a hearing and make a submission and come back. That's a fairly major road bump in capital formation. And so if there are ways that we can streamline that and actually have the smarter rules that actually address what we're trying to solve and recognize and determine whether or not it actually really is a problem as opposed to a solution looking for a problem, sometimes then I would suggest that would benefit pretty much everybody. And I think, as Paul's mentioned, there's a number of approaches that we could take. Definitely the consultation process is at the front end, I think will go a long way. But the other issue in my mind is that we need to ensure that this dialogue is always centered on the client, first and foremost. The rate of change in the last 5 years as to what the intermediaries have had to put out and paper and forms and everything has been, essentially shell-shocking to our members. And, if we're going to do anything in addition, let's just take a pause and get back to our core fundamentals as to what it is we're trying to do with smart rules. So.
Thanks, Frank. Can I turn to Paul to add some extra comments on this issue?
Sure. And I'm not going to say anything especially profound about smarter regulation because it's hard to do. What I would recommend is that when regulators make rules, they make fewer rules, they make simpler rules, and they make clearer rules. And I don't think it's worthwhile getting into a debate between principled and prescriptive rules because frankly, you need both, and it's just hard to know when you would apply one or the other. But I think it is conceivable that we could have fewer rules. They could be more simply drafted. They could be clearer. I know that's easy to say, and it's very hard to do, because the old saying, I would have made it shorter, but I didn't have time. So it's a very hard thing to do. But why do we want to do it? Because rulemaking can, instead of protecting investors, can actually compromise compliance and investor protection. It can actually make things worse. And also, rule complexity increases the cost of the regulators to administer the rules, increases the cost to adjudicate the rules, it increases the cost to comply with the rules, and ultimately increase customer costs. So make the rules fewer, simpler, clearer.
So let me pursue that a little bit, Paul, and try to connect it to the comments that Frank just made. Is the suggestion then that if you had simpler rules, they would ultimately be at the more conceptual level, leaving unique situations or customized situations to the relationship between the regulatory staff and the person who wants to get some clarity about their deal? Is that part of what the suggestion is?
Well, the reason I don't like to get into that debate is because you have the insoluble tension between the statement of the high-level principle and giving maximum flexibility for the firm to figure out how to comply, and the need for compliance to have certainty. So between those two, you've always got a push and pull. And I don't know how you resolve it, except by making the rules fewer, simpler, and clearer.
So last...
I didn't say it was easy.
But if you had to point to, an example of where that's been done really, really well as a model for how the regulators could do it in the future, can you think of, of one place in the big blue book where you think that balance has been struck really, really cleverly or carefully between detail and
Okay. Well, let me say something that might get me in a lot of trouble. The amendments to 31-103, the client-focused reforms. I think the rule is pretty clear and fairly succinct. I think the guidance is complex, wordy, unclear, and it's not clear at all in some areas how you would comply. So there's one example, I think, where they're sitting side by side.
Great, thank you,
Mary,
Paul.
can I just
Please
pick
do.
up on that and give a specific example? And this has been an ongoing conversation between Nest Wealth and the OSC for a few years now. As the traditional human interaction begins to get removed from the onboarding process and you have thousands and thousands of clients deciding to open digital accounts, and this goes towards how to do it smarter, how to regulate smarter, that theme. The notion of the OSC has been, all right, we will take the questions that have traditionally been asked in a face-to-face interaction and put them into a digital onboarding question, and that way we're still gathering the information, and the firm now is in a position to do what they need to do. And our response has always been, we're capturing masses of investors who have never had these types of conversations before, who have been put into 2.5% mutual funds for years and years and years. And even if we gather how many dependents they have, whether they have debt on their credit card, whether they have sophisticated or below average experience investing previously, it's not going to change the fact that they're going to get a diversified, risk-appropriate portfolio of low-cost ETFs. And we don't think that we should be extending the process to get them there, because that's going to make more people that should be in this type of solution drop off. And I think the regulators need to think about how they want to regulate for millions and millions of investors that might not have been involved before in actions that historically have been relegated to very few. And the answer is, in many cases, what Paul suggested. We've often stated, I need to ask your horizon and your tolerance towards risk in a creative fashion. If I have those two things, I can create a low-cost ETF portfolio for you. And anything else we're asking is probably not material to what we're trying to do. And this is a balancing act between us and a regulatory situation that's existed for decades and believes that the more information you can gather, the better off you are.
I'd like to
Very
weigh in
interesting.
on,
Please do,
on
Ian.
that question about smarter regulation. The other dimension that is really important in smart regulation is recognizing, it's not anticipating, it's recognizing that we live in a dynamic marketplace and with dynamic individuals that are changing in the face of circumstances. And what's important in all of that is, Paul's right, the mechanics of, do you need a rule, proper impact analysis and cost benefit, but I think you need to apply that to your ongoing rule book on an ongoing basis. In other words, this exercise in burden reduction, it's certainly important, it's timely, but it's something that I haven't heard said, but I think it is something that should be, in effect, institutionalized. And it has to be institutionalized for a number of reasons. I think one is because the rule book is increasingly going to be obsolete, and there are going to be better ways to regulate. So it's not just taking rules out, it's making new rules that fit much better. And I think that's something that needs to be thought through and be a part of the process.
And Ian, if bearing in mind the comment that you've made about how this has to be an ongoing process, where would you think the OSC or the regulators should start with trying to devise a smarter regulatory system?
Well, I think it's constantly looking to see where the rules need to change and how relevant they are to circumstance. The other point that I wanted to make is that I think why it's so important to do it on a systematic basis is that it gets embedded into the culture. And what I mean by that is that regulators and with respect to Maureen, it's true, the mandate is investor protection and efficient markets, but I think that it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to convince the market participants and those who are regulated that, in fact, there is a judgment brought to bear that brings a proper balance. And I think if you embed in the culture of the regulator an effort to constantly be examining the rules for their efficiency and their investor protection, I think you build confidence in the marketplace, and where that takes you at the end of the day, and this is a conversation you had earlier with Paul, is it enables you to rely more heavily on principle-based regulation, which again is important because it accommodates different kinds of models. And I know our industry is accused of being a bit schizophrenic, where people at the top of the office, of the top of the firms, like principles-based rules, but when you get into the compliance people, everybody wants a belt and suspenders approach and wants the guidelines and the rules. And I think some of that can be traced back to a lack of confidence in the judgment of the regulators. And I think that has to be built on. It's a work in progress to do that, but I think that's going to be a valuable outcome of this exercise.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. So the next topic that really builds very much on this last one is specifically about the question of to what extent can the regulators use technology and technological solutions to try to achieve smarter regulation. So, you won't be surprised that I'm going to turn to Randy first to look at that question.
So, well, technology is typically looked at as something that streamlines a process, and we've heard a lot of counterparties talk about it disintermediating the human relationship and the rest of it. There are things that actually technology is going to allow regulators to do exceptionally better than they've done historically. And I know this is the OSC's event, and I'm hesitant to bring up another regulatory body, so let me not name them. But there is another regulatory body out there, for example, that has just come out and said we are going to increase the burden dramatically on what is a suspicious transaction and how you have to report on that. And I think there are now 130 different cases. And in reality, that type of thing is next to impossible to stay on side with. And I'm using this as a principled example of how the OSC can now think about what they want to do. But the fact that technology is being introduced in firms and we're creating a module for our B2B firms that allows them to stay on top of all these STRs, but the fact that technology can standardize information, normalize it, flag it, detect connections that would have been impossible to detect before, really does begin to allow the regulators to think about a cornucopia of things that they might want to have reporting on that they haven't historically been able to hold firms, small, medium, or large, up to that level. It's half the battle, though, and this is where the regulators need to kind of pick up the other half from their burden and their sharing of the onus. Even the best solution in the world is going to flag 130 different types of suspicious transactions and then force a firm to go to some archaic third-party regulated software or fax number and send them in one by one. It's time, last I checked it was 2019 and the web's been around for a while, it's time for the regulators to start realizing that those bridges are going halfway. And if they really want to remove the burden on firms, small, medium, or large, they need to start creating their solutions with things like APIs and open architecture and the ability to take standardized information in real time. It's going to be better for them, and it's going to be immensely better for this industry. And there shouldn't be the possibility at any regulated entity across this country for someone to have a rule imposed on them that demands a paper form be submitted or a third-party system be used in a non-digital way. And if they simply worked on creating their solutions to receive the vast amount of information that people are going to be submitting from their own systems, working capital, I need to report on it quarterly, I need to keep track of it monthly. There is zero reason on earth that the four most popular accounting systems shouldn't be able to be imported directly into whatever solution they want to have my data go into so that I don't need to go and fill out their form on a monthly basis internally. These are the things that will reduce burden to a vastly greater magnitude than anything else. So technology will both raise the level of surveillance that they're able to keep, and if done well, meaning that both sides are building the bridge and they happen to meet in the middle as opposed to 12 feet apart over the middle of the ocean, it will also allow the burden on ourselves to be reduced magnificently. And that's where, if I was running the regulated or regulatory body, that's where I would focus.
Super. Thank you, Randy. Paul, I'm going to turn to you next for some follow-up comments.
Yeah, two things. One is something that the regulators could do to improve their effectiveness and efficiency. And regulators now have good risk modeling capability, and they're doing that. They're building corporately structured databases. They're doing that. You put risk modeling and structured data together, and you get predictive analytics. And that's something that regulators should embrace and employ to predict non-compliance. Non-compliance in financial statement and prospectus filings, non-compliance in registration applications, non-compliance in exempt market filings. This is an area where you can use technology to focus on the high-risk areas, give the low-risk participants a pass, put your resources where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. So that's something the regulators could do that would help them. Something that they could do that would help not only the regulators but the industry, and I'm going to just leverage on something Ian said, and that is providing easy or easier access by market participants to the data that they put in the national filing systems, CDAR and NRD. And we know how clunky the systems are today, and the CSA knows that too, so they've got a project to rebuild them into a single structured database. I think that's a great initiative. I think it has the potential to reduce costs and streamline operations. And where it will really help, and it shouldn't be that difficult, is to use an API, an application programming interface, to provide that interface between the market participant and their own data. So they could, for example, avoid this problem. The National Registration Database requires over 20 registrant data fields to be filed within 10 business days after any change to the registrant profile. Without access to their own NRD information, firms must use manual processes such as annual registrant questionnaires to keep the NRD data current. This manual process imposes a major cost burden on firms, results in poor quality data and stale data. So an API that gave controlled access of the market participant to their own data could be used in their workflow processes.
Super. Thank you, Paul. Frank, any thoughts from you?
So I think on a high level, I think there's alignment with pretty much everything said. But I don't want, from my perspective, technology is simply an enabler. It is not the end-all, be-all of communication. I really think that technology could be used in conjunction with an advisor, rep basis, because oftentimes many judgments are based on a communication and understanding with the counterparty. We can't get away from that need to talk to a warm body at the regulator to say, what do you think? Oh, by the way, did you see my filing? The SROs have been doing this for years, right? My Form 1 looks like a piece of crap today. What do you think? And they say, okay, great, we talked through it. I really think, though, that we have to be careful that we don't open up a complete open text, because I don't know that that actually benefits everyone. I think we have to be selective in the interchange of information between the participants and the regulators. So that's my 10 cents.
Thanks, Brent.
The one comment I would have on it is that in terms of technology, without looking at one particular feature of it, I would just say, if you look at the landscape, what it is you've got the dealers on one side, the regulator on the other, and in the middle you've got about 3 or 4 service providers. The big ones being Broadridge and ISM and Fidelity, and there's probably a few that I haven't mentioned. And I think the process that it works is a very conventional one. You get the regulators making the rules, the industry responding, and then the industry turning to the service providers. I think what needs to happen is the technology and the thinking around technology and the compliance with the rule needs to be integrated better. And I think the way that can work is in the early formative stages of the rulemaking. There should be discussions with the 3 parties. For example, CRM2, there was a requirement that came out of the regulator. I think what was missing in all of that was it was a hugely technology intensive amount of work. And I think a better understanding of the regulator by the regulator of the technology would have made for perhaps at least better understanding of the difficulties in implementing it, but probably would have ended up making a much more effective system. And I think that approach should be used as the OSC moves forward, getting that thinking up front, which will probably lead to a more technology, much more efficient type of rule system that's more accommodative of technology.
Super. Great. Thanks for those thoughts, Ian. I have not been as disciplined as I should be. I think we are out of time, but we still, I think, have time for questions, do we? Yes. Okay. So rather than go to the last question for the panel, I'm going to now turn it over to the audience to ask if anybody has any questions. If they don't, then I'll ask you the last question on our list. But let me invite some thoughts and comments from the audience or people on the webcast. Great, there's a question there. And a microphone that is making its way to you.
So this question is for the panel, but mainly for Frank. So as a chair of the Private Capital Markets Association of Canada, you may be particularly sensitive to the topic I'm about to bring up. So anything filed with the OSC under under Form 45-106, which is the exempt distribution, is considered to be filed for public purposes. And the rules state that in order for that whatever is filed to be considered confidential, the OSC will take a principles-based approach, which I think everyone on the panel agreed was a good approach. But in order to get the OSC to come to a view on whether the cost benefits of making something public makes sense in the given circumstances, you have to file an application. That application costs a lot of money, and as we said, imposes a burden upon people who are making exempt distribution. So I just wondering if you could speak to, as we were saying, the process. In a sense, they've achieved something everyone has talked about, which is a principles-based approach to rulemaking, and yet the method by which the decision is made still imposes the same regulatory burden that is intended to be avoided.
So I'm not quite sure what your question is. If I'm going to divine your question, it is, I guess, is there a principle-based approach with the determination as to whether or not this Form 1 is public or private? So, I don't really necessarily agree with the fact that everybody wants principle-based. As Ian has said, guys at the top want principle-based, guys at the bottom say, show me the rule. I think what is more important, though, is the process. I believe that the Securities Commissions need these F1 reports because they need to know what's happening in the exempt market. Remember, exempt market doesn't mean it's not regulated. They need statistics. They need information. I think, though, we probably need this balance of being able to file effectively, maintain some sort of anonymity, and then also make it so that it's efficient to file. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I agree with you to have to go and get an exemption or some sort of expense. Like our day-to-day operations within the exempt market shouldn't require a lawyer. I shouldn't have to go to a firm to be able to, seek an exemption request or get permission to do something that is, I should be able to pick up the phone and ask, what's the process? So I don't know if I've asked your question, but I believe that, again, this is probably something that speaks to the relationship between the registrants and the regulator. So I don't know if I answered your question, but...
You have, thanks.
Any other questions? There's one right here.
Thanks. Just more picking up on something that Mr. Cass had said. I think there's room to sort of rethink the rules themselves as they've aged. If you look at the rules we have today, they're based on the IDA, which I believe goes back to the 1930s, if my history is accurate. RS, I believe, 1970s. I do believe IROC tried to address the history of some of the rules in the plain language rewrite. But just on something as basic as KYC, it does seem like there's this instinct to constantly expand on a pre-existing rule where there might be an opportunity to do something completely differently. So, for example, you could try replacing a KYC conversation with targeted returns for different types of securities. So, money market between 0 and 2% historically, bonds between 1 and 3%, dividend-paying stocks between 3 and 5%. I'm just picking these out of the air. That would completely replace a somewhat vague and complicated conversation about what somebody's risk tolerance is, what their investment objectives are, with something a lot more concrete and specific and more modern, I think.
Look, the people that we speak with at the OSC on a continuous basis are smart, well-intentioned, good people that do want to see changes come specifically to areas like the KYC. I think everybody recognizes that a dramatic change is a hard thing to pull off in any regulated entity and under any regulatory body. But look, as much as I say to them, give me 2 questions and I'll put people in the right portfolio, perhaps an appropriate response to that would have been, all right, go for a year. And then at the end of the year, we're going to see how your people did and who complained and how many lawsuits you have against you for screwing this up. And we're going to make a judgment call on whether that's an appropriate response or not. So behavioral economics, behavioral finances, all sorts of areas that people are dying to bring into something like the KYC process. I think perhaps we just need the regulatory bodies to be, and I know the sandbox exists, but I mean, just more open and more nimble to, can we try this? Can we try this for 500 accounts and then keep an eye on them and see what happens? And look, I mean, worst case scenario, we're creating no leverage portfolios of low-cost ETFs and an account in their name. It's what's really the worst that happens for the knowledge we might be able to gather from trying something new. So yeah, I agree. We should be trying new things.
I think Paul has a...
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think challenging established thinking has got to be a part of any regulatory burden reduction. And so you raised a question I hadn't actually thought of, how could we replace a KYC process? It's been in place for a long time. It's used all over the world. Does that mean it's the best way to go? I don't know. But it's certainly something that the regulators should be challenging on a regular basis, the long-standing assumptions upon which the regulatory edifice has been built.
Thanks, Paul. Any other questions from the audience? Doesn't seem to be any interest from the webcast at the moment, so I think it's people in the room. If there's somebody at the back there, is there? Yeah. Great. Thank you.
I guess it's a question for the panel. Whether to what sense do we get a sense that the regulations have perhaps had an unintended consequence of making it harder for average Canadians average Ontarians to get the advice that they want when they're making investments, because it's harder for, if there's a lot of regulatory burden, the higher net worth clients are the ones that people want to work with, because it's the same, it's expensive to acquire the client, and so therefore the rank and file Canadians and investors are probably not getting the advice, or it's not as easy for them to get the advice to make investments that they might be interested in making that are not the easy public market investments.
Ian, I might turn to you to ask to provide an answer there.
I think it's a challenging environment to, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, to cater to the needs of all Canadians. Because number one, the needs have expanded just because of the exigencies of the demographics, the need for advice, for planning help, to build their portfolios, the loss of defined benefit plans. So it's putting a huge need on all Canadians, smaller ones, small portfolios as well as large portfolios. At the same time, it's become increasingly expensive. Now, I would say when you look out in the Canadian marketplace, there's a room for optimism, because I think there's a huge scramble and change taking place in the industry, structurally and just in terms of positioning their businesses. And I think firms like Randy's have come along and they've provided a competitive stimulus, and particularly using technology, which now is being embraced industry-wide. So the combination of technology that enables evolvement in certain areas, particularly advice, which is expensive. So now you can get online advice, you can get hybrid advice, and you get a graduated, broader array of access to advice and to products across the client spectrum. So there probably are gaps, and there are probably one can find criticisms, but I think in general, the industry, again, is changing and trying to position itself to respond to all Canadians, and there's such a wide influx, everybody from the discount online brokerage firms to the online wealth firms to the traditional players, both in my industry and in the mutual fund industry, that are changing their models to respond to the needs out there by all Canadians and the challenges that they face.
Frank.
So yeah, I just want to respond to that, because I would suggest that the average Canadian who's seeking advice really doesn't know where to go. Within our regulatory framework, we've set up these artificial constructs in terms of you got to be an IROC, you got to be an MFDA, you got to be an EMD, or you got to be a robo. So is a robo part of the OSC registrant, or is it part of the IROC? It's like this massive confusion, and I would suggest that if we were going to be innovative and creative, that we would simplify these artificial constructs to begin with and focus again on the client. Why can't a robo operate in an IROC? Maybe it can. Maybe some of them do. Why can't an EMD be in an IROC? Why can't MFDA registrant be in an IROC? Why do we have all of these particular things that make it difficult for the Canadian investing public to get the type of advice that they want? Want to reduce regulatory cost? Simplify the structures and the business models. Why can't an advisor incorporate? There's no real, doctors can incorporate and they can only kill you, right? Yet that's been a discussion item. That's been a discussion item for 20 years. I would have thought that as an industry we'd be able to churn out and address these items much quicker. And so, you know, the need for advice, electronic or one-on-one, has never been greater. And you know, as an industry and regulatory bodies, we've actually done a disservice to our clients. And I think we can do a better job.
I'll be really quick, and at the risk of ending this panel by besmirching an entire profession, I'll say we like doctors up here. we don't think they'll all kill you. I'll start with my ending.
I said they would. I said they could.
My ending is that I actually think there's never been a better time to be an investor in Canada, and I think the multitude of options that are at your disposal, whether it's a digital advisor, an online, low cost, full service, it's a vast cornucopia of options relative to 5 years ago when there wasn't a robo-advisor digital advice platform that existed in Canada. And I can tell you we have some insight into what both the traditional wealth firms, the large banks, the insurance companies and others are doing with their digital solutions and what we're doing as on our direct-to-consumer side. And I don't think there's any question that the lasting legacy of digital advice might not necessarily be the 13 companies that were digital advisors at some point in Canada, but the fact that we have forced this industry to wake up and change the way they do things and reduce their prices and become more transparent. And there are digital advisors that we power that exist in IROC and MFDA and under the OSC regulated entities. So, I mean, this is a huge opportunity for investors that have never had access to great solutions to get access to them at lower costs right now. It doesn't mean we can't do a heck of a lot better, and it doesn't mean in some cases we've succeeded in spite of the environment that we've put ourselves into, but man, the investors are doing pretty good right now.
On that happy note, I think you can see that the discussion among these panel members could have gone on all afternoon, but I think we can't do that. And so on behalf of all of you here this afternoon, I want to thank our panelists for their insightful thoughts and their expertise that they've shared with us today.
Thank you, Mary, and all the panelists. I would now like to invite panel 2 to come to the stage, please. Yes, I just want to let everyone know there will be a break after this panel, so you don't have to take your break right now. I would like to, as we move on, I would like to introduce Tim Mosley, Vice Chair at the Ontario Securities Commission, who will be moderating panel 2. This discussion will focus on how to prioritize and measure the impact of burden reduction and consider the potential impact on investor protection. Tim.
Thank you, Nizam. I want to start off by being fully compliant and say message received loud and clear from panel number 1. So I'm going to offer a principles-based birthday greeting to everyone whose birthday it is today. Happy to be here, very excited to be part of this very important initiative. Like Maureen, I spent many years living, breathing, sleeping, eating regulatory burden in the compliance role. So I'm very enthusiastic about this initiative, and I'm very heartened to see the great enthusiasm that this initiative has received from all of you and many people both inside and outside the Commission. So it's terrific. The first panel talked about ways in which burden has affected industry participants. We'll dig into that some more. What flavors does burden come in? And when we're contemplating the many possible ways of reducing burden, and we'll get into some of that, how should we assess those opportunities? How should we pick and choose and prioritize so that we do a good job of that? How do we do all of that in a way that achieves our purpose and our mandate while respecting the parts of our mandate being investor protection, fair and efficient capital markets, and managing systemic risk? These are challenging and important issues, to be sure, but no pressure for our panel. We're going to solve all of those issues in the next 45 minutes. But if anyone would be up to that task, it's our three panelists, which I'm very happy to thank for being here and welcome. My pleasure to introduce to my left Trish Callan, who is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Sun Life Financial Canada. To Trish's left, Neil Gross, who is the chair at the moment of the OSC Investor Advisory Panel, but as I think you all know, a long history of advocating on behalf of investor interests. And to Neil's left, Katie Walmsley, who's president of the Portfolio Management Association of Canada. So thank you all for leading this discussion. Let's get to it. We will, again, leave some time for questions from the audience at the end. In a few minutes, we'll talk a bit about measuring burden, but before we do that, let's come back to sources and forms of burden so that we know the full range of what we're talking about. We heard a fair bit of discussion about this from the first panel, but just to pick up a couple of those threads, we've heard about just the straight cost of complying with regulatory requirements, whether that's direct financial costs, employee time, and the like. We've heard about lack of harmonization, and we've heard about uncertainty in various guises. In other words, time and money spent trying to figure out what is actually required when the rules are unclear or high level. I want to take up the gauntlet that was thrown down by panel one and say that while we heard at least three of the four panel members refer to the tension that's always on the go between principles-based and prescriptive regulation, and certainly the many comment letters that we've received from you and others reflect that tension. I wouldn't mind just giving it a bit more of a shot with this panel and seeing whether, as we try to work through that tension, are there things that we can think about as rulemakers to better help us find the right balance between those two. Paul talked about fewer, simpler, and clearer. I like those labels, and just to pick up on clearer for a moment and to toss something out, which I'll ask the panel members to pick up in a moment. It seems to me clearer can come in a couple of different forms. One is intelligible. And, you know, we heard some comments about how some of the client-focused reforms and other rules aren't clear to understand. I think we all have to accept that the goal has to be clear and intelligible rules. It seems to me clear can also come in another form, which is precise or certain. And Ian mentioned that perhaps some of the history there is a lack of confidence in regulators' judgment about how to apply rules. It's not my job as moderator to be defensive, so I won't, but I'll suggest that perhaps another aspect, as an alternative, is that reasonable people can differ about how principles should get applied, and thus the interest for those governed by rules to have some certainty, some clarity, and predictability about how rules will get applied. So with all of that, those are just some thoughts. I know my fellow panel members won't be hesitant in disagreeing if they don't agree with things I've said. But Trish, do you want to start off, if you would, please, to pick up some of those tidbits and tell us your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, Tim, very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I'm delighted to be here. I did want to start off by disagreeing vehemently with you. However, in this case, I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree with you. Maybe Neil and I can get into an argument later about something. I'll see what I can do. So on the harmonization issue, I'll start by acknowledging that the CSA has harmonized a lot. There are, however, opportunities to improve harmonization, particularly between securities regulators and other regulators with whom they coordinate. And I'll give a couple of examples. One is we see securities regulators and the MFDA involved in the same enforcement matters. So, for example, the OSC will impose terms and conditions on registrants following conclusion of a settlement agreement with the MFDA, and the addition of something like ongoing close supervision following closure of the issue by the MFDA is burdensome both for the dealer and the registrant. I'd also suggest that there are opportunities to improve harmonization between securities and insurance regulators. As an example, for financial institutions like Sun Life with both mutual fund and segregated fund businesses, there are extensive sales practice rules for mutual funds but not for segregated funds. So for an advisor who sells both products, they're subject to different rules which can create for them unnecessary complexity in how they run their business. My final comment on this issue is that I'd be remiss if I didn't call out our support for a national securities regulator and the establishment of the Capital Markets Regulatory Authority with additional jurisdictions on board, please, as another means of increasing harmonization. Let me turn now briefly to your question on uncertainty and time spent trying to figure out what is required. The rules are clear enough, although I would echo the comments and many of the submissions about the opportunity to enhance the OSC website with up-to-date consolidations of national, multilateral, and local instruments, and including policies and guidance. The OSC website is the first stop for many of us in the industry, so making things easier to find would be very welcome. I'd also like to offer 4 areas or examples where uncertainty can cause a burden. One is, and this was touched upon in the first panel, and that is delays in finalizing and implementing regulatory change. There was a theme in the comment letters around examining the process for policy development to see things finalized and implemented more swiftly. The reality is that the length of time that proposals are in the marketplace in and of itself creates uncertainty about what the standard is as organizations try to anticipate the final outcome and adapt their business model. The CSA has a robust consultation process which is a foundation of effective rulemaking and in which we actively engage. There are, however, times when there are multiple proposals in the market for comment or implementation that have significant operational impact. As an example, to prepare for this panel, we did a back-of-the-envelope assessment of our work on the most recent CSA client-focused reforms published in June of last year. We determined that we had 30 people involved who collectively spent over 660 hours in the effort to review, consider the impact of, and comment on the reforms. Organizations like Sun Life are obviously well positioned with resources to handle, but the burden on smaller organizations can be significant. A second source of uncertainty comes from new interpretations during the prospectus filing and renewal process. This was also mentioned in the first panel. It arises primarily from having different reviewers for prospectus filings and can result in different and sometimes conflicting comments or changes to previously approved disclosure, which makes the process more burdensome than need be. We certainly would support the OSC designating a relationship manager so staff become familiar with the registrant's business and disclosure documents. A third source of uncertainty can come from enforcement action that signals a new interpretation without follow-up guidance or clarification. Registrants and issuers look to settlement agreements and commission decisions for guidance on how the OSC is interpreting the rules. There can, however, be uncertainty when a decision is released that appears to change that view and is not followed by more formal guidance. The settlement agreement between the OSC and Century Investments with respect to mutual fund sales practices is an example. It was the first enforcement action on rules that had been in place for a long time and therefore a very important decision. And it did seem to signal some changes in how the Commission was interpreting those rules. Many of us in the industry spent time poring over the settlement agreement to glean whether there were new expectations and if so, what those were. Everyone wanted to do the right thing and meet any new expectations, and it would have been helpful to have some guidance from the Commission soon after that decision. Lastly, and this is somewhat technical, but uncertainty comes from needing to apply for exemptive relief that others have obtained. For example, there's a requirement for a dealer to deliver a fund fax document following an automatic rebalance in a fund made by the fund manager. Many fund managers have obtained relief from this requirement for all of the dealers with whom they do business. However, since not all fund managers have the relief, the practical result for many dealers, including Sun Life's mutual fund dealers, is that we must deliver a fund fax on an automatic rebalance for some of the funds we offer, but not all. This doesn't really make sense for our clients, some of whom get the fund fax and some of who don't. I give this as an example, and I'd echo what Randy said on the last panel. It's certainly not the biggest problem that we have, but our view is that it's making changes like this, small changes that reduce the burden across the board, that are really going to help move the dial on this burden reduction strategy. Your last question asks about the right balance between flexibility and certainty. On this, we support tipping the scale in favor of principles and flexibility with clear guidance, acknowledging that rules are required, but on balance, we prefer principles. Principles-based approach facilitates innovation and encourages industry to take more responsibility for thinking through consequences and implications. It also allows more flexibility in interpretation and implementation, and it's easier to adapt principles than prescriptive rules to different business models. An example of how we see this work in practice is the principle of treating clients fairly. Which is something that we see both in securities and insurance regulation, although it is more extensive in insurance regulation. At Sun Life, it's often the focus of a conversation around not only the meaning or impact of a regulatory requirement, but the interpretation of a policy or product term, or how to resolve a client complaint. Using the principle of client fairness as a starting point can lead to a better and different outcome than starting with what does this specific rule say, because it necessarily requires the consideration of a broader range of issues. So for these reasons, we encourage the OSC to focus on principles rather than rules.
Thanks, Trish. If I could just ask one quick follow-up question, and then I'll ask Katie for her comments. In talking about the balance between flexibility, the combination of flexibility with clear guidance, guidance, small g, can come in a number of different forms. It could be a companion policy, a staff notice, a speech, other forms. Is there a difference for a regulated entity in the amount of burden depending on what form the guidance comes in, of the list that I just gave, or a rule even? I mean, does it matter from a burden perspective whether it comes in the form of a rule or a speech?
I think it's easier if it's in the form of the companion policy or something that's viewed as part of the Act. And again, back to my point about making things more accessible on the OSC website. What are all of the OSC's thoughts on this particular issue that I should know about? So if I've got one place that I can look, that's really helpful.
Okay, thanks very much. Katie?
Thanks, Tim. And again, thank you to the OSC for putting on this important session. For our over 270 member firms, regulatory burden reduction was so important. When we heard the OSC had struck an internal task force, we very quickly put in a comment letter before there was a public consultation and delivered that in December. So we appreciate the opportunity to present our ideas. On the topic of principle-based versus rules, again, we would, echoing Trish's comments, tip the scale in favor of principles-based. I think every comment letter we put in the last year that was securities-related made this suggestion. I would suggest the margin of error with rules is higher to get it right. You have to have very tailored regulation to specific business models, and I think principles-based just accommodates different business models, stands the test of time better as the industry evolves. And we only have to look to examples such as Enron and see the what can go wrong with a focus on rules versus principles. I also think just the one-size-fits-all is avoided with more principles-based regulation. In terms of uncertainty, I think there's a huge cost with uncertainty that happens in many situations. Rough winter for everybody. I think we all were probably caught in intersections with traffic lights out. And you have that, for me, the uncertainty of regulation is very similar to that situation when there's caution, there's no lights allowing traffic to move, and the traffic is slowed down. That is what happens in the industry when there's a gap between proposed rules and finalization of those rules. Small examples of uncertainty in the burden: startups, the time between the initial decision to start up the business, the submission to the OSC, the interview, the decision to start business. Could that be improved? That would be helpful. Audits, I think there's a lot of uncertainty for firms when there's back and forth with information being provided and interviews, and in some cases there's dead silence and waiting and concerns from business owners in terms of how that audit went. And lastly, which has been commented on by many speakers, just the delay in finalizing rules. There's a cooling effect with some of the significant changes, and I reference client-focused reforms and the proposed rules on referral arrangements. I think for many businesses that came out of left field. They weren't aware that was going to be an area that was in client-focused reforms. And there's, I think it came as a surprise to us how many business models had significant referral arrangements as part of those, and how disruptive it would be to interfere with those. And right now there's a lot of waiting to see what is going to be finalized, what the rules are going to be. And so we just encourage minimum period between those significant proposed changes and the rule finalization.
All right, thanks very much, Katie. So I think some very useful comments for us to keep in mind as we go forward with this initiative. When it comes to evaluating possible opportunities for burden reduction, we want to be as objective and disciplined about that, I think, as we can. There's a very clear recognition it's not a perfect science. It's not a matter that lends itself to quantification, pure and simple. But having said that, we may be able to make some progress down that road. OSC staff have reviewed a number of burden reduction models from around the world. We're still working on that, developing our methodology, and would welcome some comments on that topic. An example going back almost 20 years, I think, is in British Columbia generally, where it was a simple model, elegant perhaps in its simplicity, of thinking about one-for-one counting regulations. Arguably a problem with that is that it weights equally regulations that may have distinctly different burdens, as simple as you have to put your name on a form to as complex and burdensome as you have to get audited financial statements for a corporation. So that's at one end of the spectrum. We may be able to bring some quantification, as I say, to talk about costs and employee time, external advisor fees, that sort of thing, and probably worth going there. As we do this and try to combine some quantitative elements and qualitative assessments, as we home in on what we hope is a very sound methodology, what are the key components of that methodology and of an effective burden reduction strategy? Neil, do you mind kicking that off, please?
Sure. And Trish, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we're probably going to agree mostly on these things because we have in this initiative, I think, a remarkable convergence of issues and interests across the line on these things. But in terms of key components of a successful strategy, I'm sure we'd all agree the number one thing is to have a focused objective. I think we'd all agree that increasing the efficiency of regulation would be the prime objective here. And we probably also would all agree that there should be an overarching directive of do no harm in the process. Don't diminish investor protection and market integrity as you go through this process. Also, the previous panel mentioned something very important: proportionality. We want to make sure that Regulatory responses are appropriate to the nature and size of the problem. But that raises an important consideration in terms of what you've got to have to make this successful, and that is good data. You've got to have good data going in the sense of understanding the size of the problem, how big it is, how pernicious it is, in order to craft an appropriate solution that is not excessive. But you also have to have good data on the outbound side of it too, because part of reducing regulatory burden is to go back and assess whether the regulatory response is effective and whether it's overkill. So you've got to look back on these things periodically. Also, this was touched on, and Trish has mentioned it as well, and Katie has mentioned it. There's a need to have integration of burden reduction as part of the policy-making process. And particularly to ensure that you're adequately managing the burden that comes from a rapid pace of change in our society and that is reflected in securities regulation. Interestingly, that may require, as Tricia said, speeding up the process of policy development in order to prevent initiatives piling up and then suddenly being released in this sort of tsunami of regulatory change that overwhelms the industry. But also, as has been said, the idea of having these prolonged swords of Damocles hanging over the industry do have significant burdens. They do require the industry to sometimes pay opportunity costs in terms of how they develop their business. It requires them sometimes to double track what they do in order to be ready to comply with an expected change, but at the same time, the prolonged time that it takes to affect that change means they still may have to do things the old way for an extended period of time. And all of that is very, very costly. So, integration is extremely important to having a successful program. And finally, as has been said, you have to have persistence. This thing has to be integrated as part of the normal process of policy making, and it has to be done all the time.
Can I come back to your comment about proportionality and assessing the benefit to investors, so that being one of the essential components to this. This is now completely unfair and burdensome to you because we haven't rehearsed this, but it just occurred to me as you were speaking, Professor Anita Anand had an op-ed in the Globe earlier this week, and don't have it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing, but I think she said something to the effect that it can be difficult or impossible to assess the benefit to investors. I take it you don't quite agree, but maybe that's unfair. Do you mind elaborating that on a bit and talk about how we can do a good job of assessing that benefit?
Well, it is hard because, unlike costs, which can be relatively easily listed and costed out and added up, some benefits are very hard to quantify and maybe unquantifiable. I mean, how much harm has been prevented by virtue of the fact that we have a suitability rule? I mean, can you calculate? Can you put a number on that? No, you can't. So, in approaching this exercise, you've got to realize that it's a bit of a mistake to try and quantify your way through it, because you're not going to be able to put numbers on both sides of the equation. And the other thing that may be a real mistake is to even approach the issue from the standpoint of cost to the industry versus benefit to investors. Because the reality is that a lot of the costs, not all, but a lot of the costs get passed through to the investor. And a lot of the benefits of regulation are benefits to the industry, as well as to investors. So what you're really talking about is value for money in the regulation. And it's a question of value to the entire investment community, not just investors. And it's a question of cost to the entire community, not just the industry.
Right. Thank you. And let me just pick up on one point before turning over to Katie to say that, and you heard Maureen talk about this in her opening remarks, and I deliberately didn't put sort of as a tension or a fight between investor protection on the one hand and burden reduction for exactly the reasons that I just reassure people that all of us involved in this initiative are very mindful of that and that the two absolutely can go hand in hand. Katie, any thoughts you heard there that you'd like to pick up on, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with Neil's comments. You can't forget to just look at the basics of any regulatory burden reduction initiative in terms of investor protection, capital efficiency, and go back to the basic measures of those, the costs of industry time, the fees. I think there's probably in many of those 65 plus submissions a lot of low-hanging fruit and opportunities. And I think further to Neil's comment, I mean, there is some just intangibles. You're never going to be able to accurately measure and do a true cost-benefit analysis, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't take a hold of the opportunity to make the change and move forward and recognize that it's not a perfect science.
Okay, thanks. Trish?
Sure. Yeah, just a couple of additional points. Really picking up, Tim, on what you were referring to previously in BC, and because I think it's important to look at what other jurisdictions have done and try and take what has worked for them. And while it's true that you can quibble with the measure that they chose of regulatory requirements, they didn't choose the most crude measures like pages of regulations or number of regulations. They did choose requirements, and there was certainly soundness in the process that they set up, which was to do a baseline count of all of the regulatory requirements and then set a goal to reduce those, and then, as you said, have, when there was a new requirement introduced, one had to be eliminated. In the UK, they currently require 3 requirements to be eliminated for every new one added. Importantly, though, in the UK, what I think is really interesting is that they focused a lot on how they regulated versus what they regulated, and were able to drive cost reductions without sacrificing investor protections. So by doing things like, and this was mentioned in the first panel as well, simplifying forms and processes, compliance became less costly without any regulatory change or compromise of investor protections. So, for example, they've allowed public companies to use electronic versions of their annual reports, saving businesses more than £180 million sterling. So I'd like to suggest that a key component of a burden reduction strategy could be undertaking that kind of a similar exercise.
Thank you. One comment we've heard a number of times from the previous panel and this one, and I think it's not a controversial point, but it's a critical one, is to the extent we're going to rely on data or information in conducting our assessments, we should be getting good data. So perhaps we can turn the spotlight on the Commission from your perspective and say, as we go through these kinds of processes, rule making up to now and burden reduction now and going forward, or an increased emphasis on that, how good a job are we doing in gathering data? To the extent we're not doing a perfect job, what more can we do to work with industry participants, both on the investor side and the regulated entity side? What more can the regulated entities and investors groups do to provide us with that good information? Katie, do you want to start with that, please?
So I'll start with comments on sort of 2 activities that I think are very useful, and there's been a lot of growth in this area and has been very helpful in rulemaking. First, the use of external advisory committees. I think the OSC has been using this as an avenue to collect information, to monitor emerging issues and trends. They've got great people on those committees. They've been striking new committees as new issues have emerged. The FinTech Committee, the Seniors Expert Advisory Committee. So I applaud that initiative and encourage more of it. Consultation with associations. I see that happening more. I know Ian and Paul and I and our committees are in frequent contact with the OSC, and I think they are proactively reaching out pre-regulation and post, and meeting with the groups to figure out if there are any bumps in the way in terms of new rules or things they should be considering in the future and emerging issues and trends. Ways to improve information. I'll start with RAC. RAC, I don't have to remind anybody in this room that has ever filled out a risk assessment questionnaire the very large time and resource burden. I think in 2016 we had a number of members come to us who had tracked how many hours their compliance and legal teams had put into completing RAC. Very good information, good data. I can recognize why a regulator would want to gather that information. But was there a better way to get it? Was there a more efficient way to look at it? And I again, I commend the OSC. They received a lot of feedback in 2016, looked at it, and made some improvements in 2018, which were great. Changes, we'd recommend the frequency is too much. Every 2 years is just too much time and resource for the benefit. Again, cost-benefit analysis, a simple fix would be moving to every 3 years, or if that's too big a step, perhaps looking at the risk of different registrants and whether the higher risk ones could be every 2 years, the ones growing and changing and evolving their business models, and the more plain vanilla firms, lower risk, could be the every 3 years. Better use of technology in that information gathering, new technology, and I think, and this comment has come up in with other panelists, just sharing with the other CSA counterparts. Many of our members are registered across Canada, will be filling out the risk assessment questionnaire and then have an audit occur in a different jurisdiction, and it's not clear that jurisdiction has actually seen the RAC, so that would help significantly. A couple of other quick suggestions for better utilizing the data that's gathered. Outside business activity reporting. Again, this has come up earlier. A lot of time and effort goes into that. The 10-day reporting requirement. The cooling effect it has on volunteer activities, I think, is a reality. And I think the consideration should be given to the continued practice that the OSC has taken. There's no longer fining for non-material disclosures, which is great. But we'd welcome a fresh look at tracking the concerns with conflict, and is OBA the best way to do it? Could some of that tracking be delegated to compliance professionals within the firm as opposed to centralized reporting? The audits and sweeps, I think, for the most part, we're hearing good things about the audits often being helpful, the feedback letters being good. Some of the recommendations to improve the effectiveness would be continuing to ensure the timing is reasonable. If FinTrack has been in the week before, could that audit be delayed? If another Securities Commission has been in a month earlier, does there really need to be a OSC audit now? The information requests being more organized for audits, all of these sort of small tweaks would be helpful. Lastly, the questionnaires and data gathering surveys. I think there's been more use of these, which is great. We'd encourage more questionnaires, data gathering proposed rule. We think that could go a long way to eliminate the chance of proposed rules being published that are significant changes would have an impact in the industry. And if there was more data gathering before that, maybe the proposed regulation would be a little closer to what would achieve a balance between investor protection and capital market efficiency.
It's a great list. Thank you. Katie, Neil, any other ideas about things we should start doing or do better to gather good information?
Well, let me say first that I think the OSC does a very good job of getting data, and I would only recommend that you do more of three things, and that is testing, testing, and testing. It's one thing to do polling, but it really helps to bring in people and find out if they are actually understanding the disclosure, if they are really getting better educated as a result of the education initiatives that are being put forward. Testing is hard to do, and it's expensive and it's time consuming, but I think it pays enormous dividends in terms of knowing whether you are actually conceptualizing both the problem and the solution correctly. It's very easy to kind of live in your own bubble and believe that you found the right solution. At some point, and it should be early in the process rather than late, you should be putting that to the test and finding out if in fact you're right.
Okay, thank you. We'll shift back to a topic that came up earlier, but I think one that's well worth more scrutiny and emphasis, and that is smart burden reduction. So as we go forward, we'll apply the best methodology we can come up with as best we can, but as we are keeping in mind the different components of our mandate, investor protection, fair and efficient capital markets in particular, as well as management of systemic risk, are there pitfalls that we should be careful to avoid, particularly in balancing all of those components? Neil?
Well, I mentioned one earlier, which is approaching the cost-benefit analysis from the standpoint of one side bearing the costs and the other side getting the benefits. So I think you want to avoid falling into that if you can. Also, I would say, frankly, stay away from simplistic solutions. With all due respect to other jurisdictions that have implemented a one-for-one rule, I think that's idiotic. You might as well say, well, if it's a Tuesday, you have to repeal something that was enacted on a Tuesday. It just makes no sense.
Just have to cross that one off the list.
Okay, good. What you're looking for is to increase the net efficiency of the regulatory system. Like I said, there's no simplistic solution to that. There's no quant solution to that. You're going to have to use some judgment, and you're going to have to put that out for everybody to see and judge you in terms of whether you're doing a good job on that. Sorry, but that's just the way it is. And lastly, I think the other pitfall that you should try to avoid is letting anybody use this exercise as a stalking horse to question the legitimacy of your policy objectives. That's not what this should be about, and it's not what this should be allowed to be about. This should be about finding optimal ways to efficiently achieve those policy objectives rather than cutting them back.
Okay, great, thank you. Trish, any other pitfalls you think we should be careful to avoid?
One thing I wanted to talk about, so again, looking at what other jurisdictions are doing, just a few days ago, the U.S. Business Roundtable Smart Regulation Committee released a publication on what they think is a smart approach to regulation, and it embraces the following: early engagement with stakeholders, expanded use of cost-benefit analysis, greater use of risk-based performance standards in place of hard and fast mandates, and a commitment to continuous improvement. And it's this last aspect of a commitment to continuous improvement that I think falls under the category not so much of a pitfall to avoid as something to bear in mind. I think that one of the key ingredients of implementing smart burden reduction is the culture change needed to carry it out. Regulatory policymakers often focus on designing new regulatory ideas and don't necessarily systematically look for ways to reduce the costs of existing regulations. So it can be a real shift to think about eliminating requirements and processes The good thing is that many of us are focused on developing a culture of continuous improvement, so there's an opportunity to share experiences. At Sun Life, over the last 3 years, we've been executing our Client for Life strategy, which has really required a step change in how we operate. So new behaviors, actions, and initiatives that we try to put clients at the center of everything we do. And within the legal team, this has translated to developing key performance indicators to help us measure how we support our business partners in achieving our purpose. And it's caused us to look inwards at how we operate and what our processes are. I will say that it's hard work and it can be uncomfortable to put under a bit of a microscope what people have been doing and how they've been doing it for a long time. And it's also a change to be measured on the quantity of what we do as opposed to the quality of what we do, or at least in addition to the quality. But we are making progress and achieving outcomes, and I think some of these kinds of exercises are transferable to the exercise that the OSC might undertake. So we've done things like implement technology solutions to speed up what was a manual process, eliminated non-value added steps in a process, and establishing, one best way to do certain things. So again, looking at what other organizations are doing around continuous improvement might be something of benefit for the OSC.
Great. Thank you. And lots of work going on all that. And that's terrific. Thank you. So we'll turn it over to questions in just a couple of minutes, but perhaps to wrap up this segment of it, bit of a lightning round. Is there anything that you were hoping you'd get a chance to say and haven't had a chance to say, or any priorities that haven't already been mentioned that you think we ought to have in mind as we go forward? Katie?
I would just add, I think, to some of the comments that I made earlier. I know the tone and the theme and the focus is on burden reduction, cost reduction, but I think technology keeps coming up, and technology is a tool with that, which will require investment and moving forward to really move things more efficiently and streamline procedures. So again, just not to move too far the direction of cost reduction, because technology investment will need to be made.
Thank you. Neil?
I think you do have a lot of opportunity here with low-hanging fruit, matters that are essentially administrative and don't have anything to do with investor protection per se or market integrity per se. And that should be where you concentrate. As Randy said, look for early wins on that. I think you'll gain a lot of ground. I was struck and very pleased to see in the comment letters that there was so much focus on that rather than any efforts to go beyond it. And there may not be a particular need or appetite to go very far beyond that in order to accomplish your objectives on this initiative. As Katie said, the RAC is something that people point to in terms of frequency. There were a lot of frequency issues in terms of that and the OBAs. And what I have heard from a lot of industry sources as well is just you should be looking at all the ways and times that you require a double touching of the same issue or information. That's what's really driving people crazy and driving up their costs. So if you can get rid of those things, you may accomplish what's really needed here.
Great, and I must say, I think Maureen's already said it, but in fact, I know she's already said it, but we have been particularly impressed, not surprised, but impressed by the wealth of suggestions, very concrete ideas. So we've got a lot to work with, which is a terrific problem to have. Great. Trish, any last comments?
Yeah, a couple of things. I agree with both of my co-panelists on the things that you should be focusing on. First, that low-hanging fruit and the improvements that can come with technology, and then longer term. You may want to focus on more investor-focused priorities. And I just want to pick up, Neil, on your point of testing around disclosure. I think that is a really important aspect of a burden reduction in the sense that right now there are a lot of requirements across both securities and insurance regulation for documents to be written in clear and plain language, and many organizations, including Sun Life, are working hard to do that across the board. But there aren't standards. Yes, it's true that there's some guidance and some sample forms, but having more guidance on this, I think, would be helpful. And I point to the work that IFIC has recently done with BE Works on looking at the understanding of CRM2 statements. So it's hot off the press, but it's really, I think it's really important work. And when they did a behavioral audit of the CRM2 statements, they identified 2 barriers to investors' understanding of these kinds of statements, which were insufficient goal framing and information overload. And in the behaviorally informed statements that they tested, they included an intervention of showing progress against a stated goal, so something very simple, and then chunking and simplifying content. And these statements demonstrated an increased investor confidence and understanding and likelihood that investors would actually take an action to meet their goals. So again, just want to reaffirm the suggestion that this kind of work could be leveraged by the OSC in the work going forward.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll open it up to questions now. Again, if you have a question, please raise your hand and one of our folks will come to you with a microphone. Yes, we have one right up front here, please.
My question, I'll address it to Neil because he's heard it before, sort of from the opposite perspective of low-hanging fruit, looking at the regulatory burden faced by investors. Built into the regulatory regime in a very fundamental way are civil remedies as a regulatory tool, which of course rely on investors to bring various forms of civil actions where they've suffered some kind of a loss. And yet realistically, this is almost an impossible scenario if we look at the history of virtually any civil litigation involving suits by investors, whether it's class action or even more hapless individuals taking on a brokerage firm or whatever. Is there any thought to that kind of fundamental rethinking of sort of the design of the regime? Or what do you...
Well, it would be nice if securities regulators had more tools in their toolbox to obtain restitution for harmed investors. Currently, they have some of those tools, but not what I'd call a full toolkit. And we'd certainly like to see them maximizing the tools that they do have. Like to see them even pushing the envelope on that a little bit in terms of, for example, settlements that should have as a precondition full restitution having been made. And we'd also like to see the Commission have either internally or use externally qualified experts to assess whether the restitution that has been paid has in fact been full. So yes, I think there are some things that can and should be done in that regard. Some of that might require legislative change in order to get the full toolbox, but that doesn't mean that there aren't more things that can be done right now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Julia. A reminder to anyone viewing by webcast, you're welcome to ask a question by clicking the appropriate button on your screen. I think I saw another question. Yes, about the fifth row, please.
Thank you very much. A very interesting session, the whole thing so far. One of the things that I actually have to say we forgot to put in our comment letter, and I'm hopeful, I just wanted to get this comment out there, is that I would hope as part of this project, the securities regulators think about whether securities regulators need to regulate some areas. I mean, there's always been the controversy about, do we need whatever that number is, 54,102, the beneficial owner stuff, do securities regulators need to regulate proxy voting, for example? So I just feel that over the years, the regulators has expanded their scope beyond full, true, and plain disclosure. Everyone understands that. And regulating the people, the firms and the individuals who are participating in the securities markets. So that's just one comment. If I'm hopeful that that will get looked at. But I also wanted to comment, because it goes hand in hand with that, is the complexities of the drafting of some of these rules. They are, of course, not any of the 81 rules, but the other rules, some of the rules, and the 31 rules, of course, too, are okay. But some of the other rules are impossible to read. And, you know, many of us are lawyers in the audience. Just think about what our poor clients have to go through when they try and figure it out. Frank talked about having to go to lawyers. You shouldn't have to go to lawyers to try and figure out securities regulation. And I didn't put that in my comment letter either, and I wish we had. Thank you.
I was biting my tongue about rules that might have been written some years ago. But if I can just briefly, and I'll open up to anyone else as well, but just on the first point, Rebecca, just to say we're very mindful of that. We've had discussions just this week, both in the context of an emerging area, but also in the context of this project about, do we need to be regulating in this area? Should we be? And it's very much explicitly part of the mandate of this initiative to look at areas that are currently regulated and to be saying, is this outmoded? And that could be down to that very granular level, or it could be big. As Maureen said, everything's on the table. So even if you think of things you wish you'd put in your letter, if you haven't yet put in the letter, Nisa may kill me, but it's never too late. Anyone on the, Katie?
Yeah, further to Rebecca's comments on the areas that perhaps we don't need to regulate. I think a theme in many of the letters that I saw that I'd like to reiterate is the carve-outs needed for institutional clients. And I think so many of the rules are written with the retail investor in mind and are very important. And that is where the investor protection concerns really are. But often when we see the final rules published and our institutional managers are reading them and they're looking at them thinking, how do I implement that, and what value is this adding for my institutional pension clients, foundation clients, et cetera. So I'd echo Rebecca's comments that there's opportunities there.
Okay, any other questions in the room? No. Okay, well, there was a terrific discussion. I'd ask you please to join me in thanking our panelists for a great treatment of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and our panel. We will now take a short break and promptly start at 3:40. So look forward to seeing you back soon for what we hope will be another interesting panel discussion. Thank you. Two panels that we heard have provided us with the perspective of market participants and investors on getting the regulatory balance right. So we have effective regulation to protect investors while minimizing the regulatory burden on market participants, what has been referred to as smart regulation. It also felt a little bit like capital markets therapy. So it was a very good hearing all the different perspectives and the candid perspectives. It tells us that this process is working as intended. In this panel, we'll be hearing from representatives of three key regulators on the way forward and where we as regulators should focus our efforts. I know it's early days and there will be additional developments as the comments we received are reviewed, as today's comments are digested, and further roundtables are held. But we did want to start this very important conversation today with a panel of regulators. We have with us, on my left, Deborah Foubert, who is the Director of the Compliance and Registrant Regulation Branch at the Ontario Securities Commission. On her left is Andrew Krigler, the President and Chief Operating Officer of the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. And then next to him, Karen McGuinness, Senior Vice President, Member Regulation Compliance at the Mutual Fund Dealers Association. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start by asking each of you how your organization is addressing burden reduction. What are the key areas of focus? What challenges do you foresee? Are there any specific steps you're already contemplating within your organization? And how, one of the issues that has come up, how will you work together to reduce regulatory burden? I'll start with Andrew.
Thanks, Nizam. So I suppose it's fair to say that there aren't that many new ideas, and reducing regulatory burden isn't a new idea, but it is a good one. We took the approach beginning about a year and a half ago of trying to look at what the challenges were in the industry to serving Canadians better, and what the obstacles were in the way of that. So over the course of the last year, we worked with a variety of industry stakeholders in partnership with our colleagues at Accenture, and tried to look at where they saw the needs for Canadians evolving in terms of the types of advice, financial products, and financial services that they wanted to consume. Building off of that, we asked the question, what's stopping you from getting there? And a good portion of that answer is the form and structure and application of regulation. It's not all of it, but it is a big part of it. So the approach we've taken to the question of regulatory burden is perhaps the other side of the coin, the same coin that this discussion is about today and that the OSC's efforts are about. But it's focused on looking at what needs to be prepared for the future. And I think there's a couple of interesting things that have come out of it, many of which have already been touched on by our colleagues earlier in the day. The issues around duplication of regulation or regulatory processes, either within regulators or across regulators. The literal application of rules that were designed in a different time, and perhaps the inability of some organizations, including our own from time to time, to apply them based on the principle or the regulatory policy objective that had originally been formulated. So a good piece of what we're going to be doing over the course of the next couple of years is preparing our regulatory framework under the auspices of the CSA, to whom we report, to prepare for the future. So I think there's a lot that I can go into on that, but I don't want to suck all of the oxygen out of the room. I will highlight that we published our report with Accenture a couple days ago, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it. There are a variety of ways in which I think we can make the system better in cooperation with the industry, in cooperation with our colleagues at the CSA, and importantly, working side by side with the investors whom we all serve across the country.
Thanks, Andrew. And who's the Chief Executive Officer for that? Karen, what would you say from the perspective of the MFDA?
Thank you for inviting me today. I'd say that assessing the impact to the industry and investors is something that is incorporated into everything that we do. Before we even consider a rule amendment, for example, the first question we ask is, do we need a new requirement, or do we just need to be more effective in the application of the existing rules? So can we accomplish better results, for example, through a combination of additional guidance, or perhaps a focus in compliance and enforcement rather than creating a new requirement? In some cases, we have to, or we do believe it's appropriate to develop a new rule. And in those cases, we don't engage in any drafting process until we can clearly articulate the objective of the rule or what outcome we're trying to achieve. And we don't start the drafting process until we can understand how our members and their advisors will operationalize the new requirement. So what are we looking for from advisors in terms of their behavior, and what are we looking for from members in terms of their ability to supervise compliance with the new requirements? And sometimes to fully understand the operational impact of a new requirement, we need to engage in advanced consultation with the industry and that might involve a discussion paper or multiple discussion papers. It might involve establishing working groups, or it might be undertaken through our regular outreach initiatives like our member regulation forums. As I mentioned, not only do we look at the impact of the industry, but we also look at client impact. And in assessing the client impact, we don't just look at what are the investor protection benefits, but we also look at whether the new rule will impede or somehow improve the efficiency of the advisory process. We also keep in mind that anything that adds cost to the industry will likely translate into costs to clients, to investors. And one of the important benefits of the client research that we performed last year is it has improved our ability to assess client impact. So as some of you may know, we have data on all the 9 million households that are serviced by MFDA members, and we do use that data to help us better understand client outcomes and assess the impact of regulatory change. Periodically, we also do a review of our rulebook, which we're in the process of doing now. And when reviewing our rulebook, we consider whether there are requirements that are outdated, given the changes to the industry, or if there are rules that are no longer providing sufficient investor protection value. Right now, we're also currently in the middle of a member outreach initiative, and there's some preliminary themes coming from members as part of that project. One, members are looking for more guidance to assist them in complying with our regulatory requirements. And we fully support this request because we do not want the first time a member to hear about or to become aware of an MFDA interpretation is through a compliance examination or worse, an enforcement process. The second theme coming out of our outreach initiative is that members are looking for greater flexibility in their supervisory structures or supervisory systems, and this is being driven by both advancements in technology as well as new business models. So of course, we're considering these comments in our rulebook review process. And then finally, we have seen an increase in members offering model portfolio solutions to clients in order to allow advisors to focus more on client needs and provide more holistic goals-based financial planning advice. So members have been asking us to consider new business models which would allow for better client service, and we're currently in the process of evaluating those proposals. One final initiative that we have been engaged in the last several years is our innovation outreach. So members are increasingly adopting new technology to enhance efficiency or to offer new products and services to clients, and we've been encouraging them to proactively collaborate with us to facilitate a successful and compliant implementation. And this initiative has kept our compliance department quite busy. I'd say that probably we're meeting with members at least weekly outside the context of an examination to discuss operational changes. And it might be small operational changes or it might be quite substantive. So these direct communications have provided us insight into emerging issues and how our members are positioning themselves to meet the future needs of their clients as well as the needs of their advisor base. And of course, that information that we obtain through this process, that's really helped us form our own strategic initiatives and our current regulatory approach.
Thanks, Karen. Deb?
So I don't know how I got the honor of representing all of my esteemed colleagues at the OSC, but there may be paybacks at some time. And also throughout the break, I was trying to come up with a new acronym for OBAs because, you know, I'm trying to get something punchy. And in the short period of time, I wasn't able to come up with anything on that. But we'll keep working on that. So I just wanted to say, you know, as the OSC, we're really committed into evaluating all of the proposals that were put forward through the comment period. We're committed to reviewing our internal processes and regulatory requirements to determine where we can reduce burden without compromising our regulatory mandate. I know that there's many initiatives within the OSC already that is focused on this, and staff is totally engaged. There's things that we see on a daily basis that we're like, oh my gosh, we got to change this. So this has given us new vim and vigor to be able to go through and look at those, and you know, especially to knock off some of the ones off of my list. So we are looking at, outdated regulatory requirements. Data is very important now, and we've been enhancing our use of data as technology advances. So we're looking at, data that may have been collected before, which may not be useful now, and whether or not, or if our information needs have changed, that the data isn't meeting our purpose. So, we're totally behind that. Redundant data collection or filing requirements, delays that may impact approvals. Everybody within the organization is looking at places where we can reduce burden, focus on our mandate to be able to make it an easier working relationship with all of our registrants as well. So, we were talking about some challenges. I think with disharmony brings about regulatory burden, so we are working, obviously we have to work with our CSA partners, our SRO partners. We do that very well. We're always in contact. We always have avenues of communicating and discussing and trying to work on things together. So if there is overlap, we're happy to look at those, and there have been many suggestions put through the comment period, so we definitely will be looking at all of those. But we definitely are supportive of that. Technology, yes, we know everything. Everything could be benefit from better technology, and we're taking initiatives to do that. One example is that with all of the client-focused reform letters that we received, we did some natural language processing on those letters to be able to get some sentiment analysis. So we as an organization are trying to embrace new uses for technology where we can as well. So I think that from the perspective of the OSC, we are totally committed to this. Staff is energized about this and open to looking at all of the opportunities and working with all of our partners to be able to make this happen.
So to follow on that point, you all, first, we're very grateful for Andrew and Karen for joining us, because while this is an OSC initiative, it's obvious that it has to involve the SROs and also the CSA. So you all do, similar things, oversight, enforcement, policy making, and we all have different sort of phases of called modernization or burden reduction type ideas. How much opportunity do you see for collaboration along all these lines, both in terms of these different areas that we are all engaged in, and basically, essentially going forward, what opportunities do you see, for collaboration? And Andrew looks like he's very interested in going first, so I'll let him.
I think it's interesting because we've talked about burden reduction today in the context of securities regulation. But I think we all have to acknowledge that as Canadians' needs evolve, they're consuming financial services that touch more than one regulatory sphere. I think that point's been made already. And that brings Canadians in touch with more than one regulator at the same time. And sometimes that can be difficult. Our earlier panelists spoke about the intersection between securities regulation and insurance regulation as one example, and it's a good one. So I think the bar is continually getting higher for us to collaborate and coordinate and cooperate with our regulatory partners, be they members of the CSA, who also oversee us, be it our insurance colleagues, be it our federal colleagues at FinTrack or at OSFI or at CDIC or the Bank of Canada. And that is just going to get more important rather than less. And I think the reason that we need to emphasize this is because the way in which Canadians' needs are evolving, their wants are evolving, is happening under three different dimensions at the same time. It's the types of products and services that they want to consume, sort of the what. It's the level of advice or not that they choose to want to get during that process, the how. Do they want to do it themselves? Do they want to interact with an advisor of some kind at some point? And at what points in their process in their lives do they want to have that interaction, the when? And so there are points at which you will be in a very intensive, we could be in a very intensive relationship with an advice giver, and other points when you may want to do it yourself. And all that's fine. And the challenge is that our regulatory model, and I think this is true for the IROC world, I don't want to speak for my colleagues at the table here, wasn't built in a time when the flexibility to move up and down that spectrum existed. And it's there now. So that means our regulatory model has to adapt to be equally flexible. What does that mean? That means on a risk basis, if there's less risk in the product-client connection, then there's probably less directive or less prescriptive oversight that needs to be applied. But if it's more complex, higher touch, what have you, then there's probably more that needs to be applied. But it needs to be scalable up and down. You know, Randy spoke earlier about the challenges to bringing in a scalable model. And one of the reasons that I think that was really important is because scalability, at least in one form, also means access. And we do talk from time to time about access to advice and access to financial products writ large. But I think it's really important to underline that, to me anyway, access to advice actually is an investor protection element. Because if you're sending people out into the world without access to the advice they need to make the proper financial decisions, that's not going to lead to a good outcome for society. So the more we can make the system more flexible and more scalable, the better off not only the industry, but ultimately the Canadians that they serve will be.
So Karen, just going to you then, it looks like what's a sort of red tape burden reduction beginning sort of moves into some level of modernization. And so, how do you see that, especially in the context of the collaboration among regulators?
Yeah, I think I echo Andrew's comments that there has to be more flexibility, and you do see some merging of services between the various registrant categories, and that makes you question, does our current regulatory model facilitate that movement for clients? And so certainly I agree with that. I think though that those are bigger questions. I think there's probably even more we can do in terms of easier wins within our various groups as it stands right now. So I do believe, we do our best to harmonize. But sometimes you're so focused, when you're a regulator and you're dealing with a particular issue, it's instances like this or initiatives like this that make you stand back and say, should we be communicating some of these things more across, across regulators, and how do we do that, and how do we improve collaboration? So I think there are easier wins that we could be looking at, or shorter-term wins, but I do agree with Andrew that a review of the entire regulatory model is definitely something that should happen, and I think we encourage that to happen as soon as possible.
So, Deb?
I think I actually asked for a review of the entire regulatory model, but now that you bring it up, in some people's minds, there is an elephant in the room that's got regulatory model written on the side of it. So,
I'll just take that as us agreeing.
I'll agree on the item about there definitely is blurring of lines between what we do. So I do know that we do attempt to make sure that we don't overlap and put duplication on. So I do think that we have a very good working relationship on that. But there's definitely more that we can do. There's a lot of things that came through on the comment letters. I heard a couple of people talk about the 31-103, 11-9, 11-10 filings and stuff like that. So, there are areas, obviously, as I said, we're open to looking at everything. I think with Maureen's statement that we're going to be bucketing them into short, medium, and long-term goals, that we'll be able to address a lot of those items and work with everyone the best we can.
So then moving to the comments and the discussion so far with the other two panels, and I'll start with you, Karen, on this. Was there anything in the comments that you saw, the written comments and the discussion of the prior panel that has changed your views in terms of what the focus should be from your perspective? And was there anything that you were surprised that you heard or that you were surprised you didn't hear? And I'll be asking the same of the other panelists too.
Sure. I would say that I think there's a lot of commonality of the comments that are coming out of the panels, as well as the submissions. I did read some of the submissions that were submitted as part of your survey. And I think at a high level, what the industry is looking for is harmonization by all regulators across Canada, and probably more aspirationally across all financial services segments. I think they're looking for elimination of regulatory duplication. And I think what really came across is they're looking for reasonable and practical application of regulatory requirements. And I know there were some issues raised by investor advocates. They were concerned that this burden reduction initiative shouldn't be about just eliminating regulatory requirements, which could have negative impact to investors. I haven't heard that. In fact, I've heard the opposite. I don't think the industry is looking for wholesale elimination of requirements, but I think they're looking for reasonable application of the requirements in a manner that makes sense for their business model. I think they're also looking for more guidance on how to comply with regulatory requirements, and I think they're looking for greater opportunities to engage with regulators, to provide input in terms of how regulations impact their operations, and perhaps suggest alternatives which could achieve the same objective, but maybe more in line with their business models. So I think all of those general requests, there's actionable items in each of those areas.
Deb?
So definitely there were thoughtful comments. I mean, there was a lot of broad general comments and then very specific, which is always good because we can action those. So I think overall that we're very appreciative of all the comments, and we're still through the process of reviewing. So not only did we get the industry comments, we've got staff comments too that we're working through, and so there's still definitely a lot of work to work through on that. The one thing out of the comment letters, though, that I thought was interesting was the difference of opinion regarding guidance. So, we especially in the compliance department, when we do compliance reviews, we base it upon securities law requirements. But then certain times we discuss guidance. And so I think that there's been some confusion maybe about how guidance is used within compliance reviews. A number of branches do compliance review activity. So, I mean, obviously we always ground everything that we do within the actual legal requirements. Guidance is really there for helping registrants comply with the regulatory guidance or understand where the staff is coming from. And I think that we've done a lot in the past couple of years to help registrants get information and access to more guidance. I mean, there's every year we publish the annual report for dealers, advisors, and investment fund managers, where we talk about common deficiencies and we talk about best practices that we learn. So that way, there's a sharing of information and a transparency about best practices in the industry. We've also done the topical guide for registrants, where we do links to the relevant guidance for over 100 topics. So, I mean, I think that, guidance, the prior panel talked about principle versus prescriptive type regulatory regime. You're going to need guidance, and so we've often been asked by registrants for more guidance. So, but then in some of the comment letters, there was comments about there's too much guidance. So we've got to strike that right balance. Obviously, we don't have the right balance at this point. So I think that all of our organizations rely upon guidance as being transparent on how staff think. So I think we're going to have to look at that and strike the right balance between, what we're providing and what the industry needs are.
Yeah, can I just mention something? Like, one of the things I saw in the comments was comments that the industry wanted more guidance, but then they didn't want you to use that guidance when you actually do your examinations. And I would suggest to you that's unrealistic, that when you put out guidance, we want to be transparent about what we expect in an examination, what we're looking for, where I agree that as guidance, there might be different ways to meet those objectives. But I don't think people should be surprised that our regulatory staff, our compliance staff, our enforcement staff are actually, the way they're interpreting the rules, if we provided guidance that provides some clarity in terms of how we do interpret them.
So just to sort of take that on, a little further, is one of the concerns, though, that perhaps guidance is used to expand, the scope of what's being regulated over and above, say, the requirements? Is that, one of the concerns? And I mean, Andrews can start with that, and I can have the others add in together with your thoughts on what you heard from the comments and the prior roundtables, panels.
Sure. Well, I'll touch on that one, I think, and then maybe go on from there a little bit. I think the ability to use guidance to clarify expectations is important because particularly as we move, as I think most people in the industry and indeed most of our colleague regulators feel that more principle-based rules are appropriate, interpretation is inherently a part of a principle-based rule set. So you have to be able to give some context, some perspective as to how those might be applied in certain circumstances. Otherwise, what you end up doing is putting all the discretion in the hands of the regulatory body, and I don't think that's actually what the industry wants, because it makes it harder to understand what the expectations are. So I think that's the one observation I'd make. I think the other point in terms of the earlier comments that were made that I really want to underline, because I thought it was terrific, it was Trish's comment. The goal of this exercise is to make compliance less costly. It's not to stop compliance. It's to make it less costly, make it more, and I would say the other side of that phrase is to make it more effective. And that's where the debate or the use of technology really has to come to the fore. Because the way in which the system, and the IROC system, the NFDA system, the OSCs, l'Autorité des marchés financiers, everybody, the way in which we sought to verify that compliance was happening was built in a world where a lot of the technology that we have today simply didn't exist. So let me give you just quickly two examples. KYC. The automation of account opening offers enormous opportunity for greater consistency, greater quality of data, better insights about the client and their needs and their risks. But it, of course, also needs to be overseen in a fashion that actually works. Well, we're open to that. We want that. I think all of you want that as well. So there's a lot there. Another, just very quickly, one more, is trade supervision, which is less of an issue for some parts of regulators than others. But gosh, trade supervision screams out for big data analysis. It's not pulling a sample of 10. It's looking at the entire trade profile and asking what the data tells you you should be looking at in more detail. That's the goal, the policy goal of the underlying regulation. It's not worded that way today, and that's one of the ones that we're going to fix with the help of all of you in this room and across the country. But those are the ways in which we need to apply technology to make compliance less costly and more effective.
Thanks, Andrew. Now, just moving to something that came up in the earlier panel, in the second panel, which was the question of how do you prioritize and cost out burden reduction initiatives, and to what extent can industry and market participants help you do that? What kind of information, what kind of assistance do you think you would need in doing an effective burden reduction prioritization and costing out to make sure that we're focused on the right on the right issues. So, Deb, from your point of view.
So let me start with the costing component, because we had already started with our Registrant Advisory Committee and a couple industry associations to get a handle on cost of compliance, right? Because everybody is saying cost of compliance is increasing, which, there is evidence to support that. But I think that we're trying to attempt to get a baseline of what the cost of compliance is, and how to determine what actually goes into that bucket of cost of compliance. Through just our work with our Registrant Advisory Committee, we're learning that there's so many differences of opinion as to what should be included in calculating the cost of compliance, and there's infinite ways firms are allocating those costs along business lines. So, and plus there's also a ton of regulatory obligations outside of securities law that add substantial costs. Somebody had mentioned FinTrack reporting requirements. So we really are trying to work with our Registrant Advisory Committee and anyone else that wants to take up the challenge to come through and really try to develop what we can say as a model to be able to cost out securities law compliance. Now, we've just started it with our little group first, but we anticipate that we'll be able to work with our SRO partners on that as well, to be able to come up and say, okay, when we talk about cost of compliance, these are the factors that go into developing the cost of compliance. And then we know that there's going to be, obviously, there's different business models and there's different elements when you go through the size of business units. So that's really where I think if we have a baseline to determine what cost of compliance is now, then we'll have a better marker to be able to say, how much burden we've been able to move, to eliminate in that respect. So that is, that's work that we're doing now. And on the question about how do we prioritize, well, I think that, we're going to be communicating through other roundtables coming up in May. So, very interested in finding out what people think, what the the items to be prioritized are. So, there's going to be a lot of communication back and forth, I would say. And once we get through all the letters, then we'll have communication on that.
Andrew?
So a couple of thoughts. First, I'll just reference back the kind of outreach to the industry that we did as part of this report that I mentioned earlier, the evolution of advice. The most important part of it, I think, is not just the sheer number of people and organizations that we spoke to, which is, more than 60 executives, 25 or 30 organizations, not only IROC dealers, but direct registrants of the commissions, MFDA dealers, others, service providers. I think Ian mentioned Broadridge and ISM and others, to get different perspectives. But it's not only that, it's the type of people we spoke to at those organizations. And I think that's a key part of this next journey that for the OSC, but also for ourselves in what we're doing on the evolution of advice. And that is, we spoke to business and strategy leaders, not only to those charged with governance and or compliance, because you have to get both points of view. The business leaders are driving their businesses forward because they see a need to be fulfilled, to be met on the heart of their clients and their customers. And the compliance and legal folks are saying, okay, these are the guardrails we have to operate in. If you don't know where they're kind of trying to take the business, having the conversation with the compliance folks gives you half the story. You don't know where they're going. And so I think that's the most important part of the next phase of our exercise, and I think it's a useful a lesson for us to pass on to our colleagues here at the table. The other thing I would say in terms of how we get the most out of the interactions with the industry to focus on burden reduction or planning for innovation is to encourage all of you to be bold, to challenge established wisdom, because otherwise we're going to come up with maybe evolutionary change. And I think there's an opportunity, given, for example, the kinds of technological capabilities that the world is providing us, for something a little more dramatic than that. I mean, some of those will, if you are bold, will kick out ideas that may not be acceptable to everybody, and that's okay. We have to have the debate about the ideas. I will, for example, probably not immediately agree with Randy's contention that you can do a 2-question KYC and you're done. On the other hand, I might agree with Frank Laperriere's comment that perhaps, some flexibility to allow organizations to consolidate their regulatory oversight would be a good idea. But the debate needs to happen, and it needs to happen with the right people at the table. And that includes all of those charged with compliance, legal oversight, and the business leaders.
So, Karen, any thoughts? And then we have talking about technology, we have a question from our webcast that and I'll read out after.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think if I would give a recommendation, it would be to thoroughly engage in the process or the opportunities that are available to you. So I think we've talked about not just this initiative, but Andrew's talked about the initiatives they have at IROC, and of course we've got our outreach initiative. And that is really designed to understand all the issues and the challenges, and also where the industry, how they see, what are their strategic directions, what do they see this industry looking like 1, 3, 5, 10 years from now. So I really think it's important to engage, and it looks like there is a lot of interest in this topic. I would also make the other recommendation that, and it kind of came up in some of the earlier panels, that burden reduction isn't just about rules or amending rules or policy initiatives. It's also about us being effective. Are there ways that we can be more effective in meeting our mandates as well? I know there was a discussion about websites and how to transfer information back and forth between the registrants and the regulators. So I would certainly recommend any thoughts with respect to that, that you would submit them to us, because that's valuable information, and it helps us improve efficiencies of our own operations.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start the question phase of our panel discussion, and I'll start the question from the webcast. Someone asked, please comment on whether we can simplify the process for verifying accredited investor status through technological solutions.
Yes.
Yes.
But it goes beyond that. It's not just verifying accredited investor status. It's making the process by which you verify the identity of your client for money laundering and other purposes more effective and more efficient. So yes, there's a variety of ways in which we need to work with the industry to make obtaining the policy objective easier.
So, I mean, the issue of technological, solutions in different ways, how regulators interface with the regulated, how the regulated, the registrants and others interact with their clients. That has come up over and over again. Is technology, do you think, is one of the big areas we should be focusing on as we go forward in terms of this process?
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely going to be a part of where we go in the future. And actually, I'm surprised there hasn't been more advancements in the know your client type activity. Like most of it is focusing around money laundering type activity, but it hasn't really gotten, from what we've seen, into the realm of the securities law and investment profiles and things like that, or the accredited investor understanding. So yes, I mean, I think that's the way that we have to be able to move in the future, and I don't think that there's anything that, in the things that we do that inhibit that, as long as the regulatory objective is able to be maintained. We don't dictate how things are being done or what mechanism it has to be done. As long as the regulatory principle is met, in my opinion, more power to them.
Yeah, I would echo that. I'd go a little further in a sense. It's not so much how you get there, where you get, and that there continues to be someone or some organization that's accountable for for delivery on that. So, you know, from an earlier part of my life, I was a prudential regulator, and one of the things that we did in that organization was allow sufficiently sophisticated financial institutions to calculate some of their own capital guidelines. Well, we vetted the models to make sure that we agreed with the way in which they were working. So there's someone accountable to make sure that it all kind of fits together. There are a variety of ways, we've outlined some of them today, where technology can aid the system in getting to the policy objective. Just let's use them.
So we have another question that's that goes broader, and and I'll just read it out. Most individuals will have to rely on the investments to fund their retirement. If you look at where professional pension fund investors invest the funds under their management, public markets are no longer a priority, something that came up in the first panel. Could the burden reduction exercise be an opportunity to reflect on whether our system, which essentially restricts most individual investors to the public markets, provides access to the right types of investments, obviously beyond the public market? So Karen, will you take that on?
I think that's a Deb response, actually, mainly because we don't
have to go back
a...
and work with Deb, so I was hoping to give that to you first.
No, the only reason why I say that is because obviously all the investments that our members are essentially selling are investment funds, or at least 96% of it. So I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer it.
So I would say that with the spectrum of the exempt market, I think Frank mentioned that earlier in the presentation. You know, there is a variety of products that are available in the exempt market. I think, yes, we have to be open to be looking at the exempt market, because that drives capital formation, and that helps Ontario and it helps Canada to be able to capital raise. So yes, I think that there's obviously, we have to look at that. We have to be open. But the investors in that arena have to know the risks, right? I mean, it's usually exempt market products could be illiquid. And, you know, if people have high concentration of their retirement funds in illiquid investments, you know, that's stuff to be concerned about as well. So I think that, of course, we would always be open to looking at that. But you got to balance off the risks and versus, you know, what retail investors understand.
So on that note, on the issue of balance, I'm going to end this very interesting panel. And thank you to our panelists and for a very informative, interesting discussion. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Nizam, and thank you to our last panel. So without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the Honourable Victor Fedeli, Ontario's Minister of Finance and the MPP for Nipissing. Minister Fedeli hails from North Bay, where his company, Fedeli Advertising, was once ranked among the 50 best places to work in Canada. Following the sale of his firm, he dedicated the next 11 years to various nonprofits before entering politics. He won 2 terms as mayor of North Bay, both with landslide victories, before being elected as MP in 2011. He has served as the energy critic and finance critic, and in 2018 was appointed as Ontario Finance Minister and Chair of Cabinet, and my boss. As Finance Minister, he's demonstrated a clear focus on enhancing Ontario's economic competitiveness and creating opportunities for business and investors. And as you heard today, we're working closely with the Ministry of Finance on our burden reduction efforts, as well as on numerous other projects that fall under our mandate. So we value the Minister's support as we continue our efforts in coming months and years, and very pleased that he was able to make it today and to be able to speak with us. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Victor Fedeli to the podium.
I love that. Thank you. How's that? Thank you. You want the rest of it all? Yeah. Thanks. That was my commission, that last piece. Hi, everybody. I'm Vic Fedeli, MPP from
the great riding of Nipissing, and it's so wonderful to see so many of you here today and so many friends actually in the audience. Maureen, thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's been great getting to know you and working with you, and I'm so pleased with the developments today. I want to welcome Greg Orenchek, the Deputy Minister of Finance, and just an unbelievably great partner for us. I'm going to use the expression, there's no daylight between us on all of our issues that we go through. So Maureen, it's been really wonderful working with you and Greg as we talk about the burden reduction plan. We have Eric and Robert and Rahul from my office here. They don't let me go anywhere without them. So we brought the team along, and Eric has been here all day, and I understand from Eric that the discussions were very productive towards the reducing the burden on businesses and investors who engage in Ontario's capital markets. Premier Doug Ford sends his greetings. We just left our cabinet meeting so I could come here, but he also has sent a very clear message that Ontario is open for business and open for jobs. All right, we'll go with that. Our government made a commitment to reduce red tape by 25% by the year 2020. It's an ambitious target that we're taking very seriously by introducing legislation a couple of times a year. And the Premier is so committed to this red tape reduction. It's not a bumper sticker. It is a genuine effort to reduce red tape, the burden of red tape. So much so that he's appointed somebody I'm sure is quite familiar to all of you, Giles Gerson, who is the Deputy Minister of Red Tape. That's how serious that the Premier takes this. And so in the financial sector, this means enhancing fairness, efficiency, competitiveness of our capital markets. We've been working with Maureen and her outstanding team at the Ontario Securities Commission as we all move towards burden reduction agenda. For the OSC, one of those joint initiatives is today's roundtable. So congratulations. We want to continue to identify ways to save time and money for issuers, registrants, investors, and other market participants. We want to identify ways to save time and money and that, I think, is the exact thing that's happening, Maureen, and we're just we're very grateful that how serious you're taking this, you're taking this effort. The work you're doing on the part of the OSC's Burden Reduction Task Force will help regulators to consider and act on any suggestions to eliminate unnecessary rules and processes while protecting investors and the integrity of our markets. You know, we can't do this without you. The Premier, as we've talked about, we're trying to reduce by 25% over the next couple of years. That is thousands of pieces of red tape that we need to reduce. We need to hear about them from you. We need to hear these individual pieces that are getting in your way, standing in the way of progress and creating jobs and opportunities. So we need to hear those very specific ones from you. Your input will be greatly appreciated and will not be ignored. We want to make Ontario a leading destination for investment and job creation, and that starts with making it simpler and faster to do business in our province and removing unnecessary and outdated barriers to investment. As a government, we know we simply cannot do this alone, and we do need your ideas to inform our work. Finance Department is working very closely with the regulators to drive financial innovation and lighten the regulatory load for businesses. The OSC's burden reduction initiatives represent some of the outstanding work being done on this front. Ontario is also leading the implementation of the Cooperative Capital Markets Regulatory System, the CCMR. As the co-chair of the Council of Ministers for CCMR, it's important for us to streamline capital markets regulation across participating jurisdictions in Canada to avoid unnecessary duplication and technical barriers. We really do see the CCMR as yet one more very serious way for cutting of red tape and burden reduction. We're a very big supporter of financial innovation. We want to restore the province's position as a leader in financial innovation, and that includes embracing technology, finding better ways to serve investors and consumers, and supporting our emerging fintech sector. So these are the types of things we're thinking about as our team at Finance is totally consumed right now with planning our government's, or I guess presenting our government's first budget on April 11th. You know, we did inherit a significant fiscal challenge from the previous government, $15 billion deficit and a $346 billion debt burden. That's 346 with 9 zeros behind it. I think you all are eminently aware of that. I put it simply when I say the previous government was spending $40 million a day more than they were taking in. It was not sustainable, and we're working to put Ontario back on a healthy financial footing. The 2019 budget, April 11th, will not only outline our path to return the province to balance in a responsible manner, but it will also continue our work to promote economic growth and job creation, including strengthening our capital markets. It's worth noting that our government's first steps towards restoring Ontario's fiscal health are indeed paying off. Businesses are investing, expanding, and hiring. In fact, Ontario has created 132,000 jobs since our election in June. And thanks to stronger economic growth, our third quarter report shows we have reduced our inherited $15 billion deficit down to $13.5 billion. So we're on the right track by taking decisive action to create the right business climate for companies to invest, to grow, and of course, to prosper. So we value your comments about reducing the regulatory burden, and we will thoroughly consider what you have said today. Thanks again for sharing your time, your experience, and your perspectives today. Our government will continue to find ways to work with the OSC to drive innovation and reduce the burden on business in the financial services sector. I want to thank you, Maureen, for the excellent work on that front and for the opportunity to say hello and begin our journey together for the next 4 years. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Minister Fedeli, for not only for joining us, but for those very thoughtful remarks. And I'd like to thank all of you for participating in today's roundtable. As I mentioned earlier, we value your perspective, your candid comments, and your suggestions. I'd also like to thank our panelists and moderators. We will be taking everything that we've heard today, along with the comments and suggestions that we received, and we'll consider them very carefully as we move forward, and we will address each and every one of them. A reminder that we have 2 additional roundtables coming up, one on May 6th and one on May 27th. You can find the details. We've divided them into different buckets so that you can attend one that is most particular to your comments and experience. So I'd like to thank you all for being here today. It was a great day for us, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.